The water is dark here. Not the kind of dark that frightens, but the kind that holds. A deep mineral dark, the colour of old jade where the light stops trying. You are suspended somewhere between the surface and the abyss, in that middle layer of the Cretaceous sea where the temperature never changes and the pressure wraps around you like a second skin. There is no wind here, no tide, not really, only the slow pulse of currents that have been moving in the same direction for thousands of years. Somewhere far above you, the surface catches the last amber of a Cretaceous afternoon, trembling and scattering into fragments of gold that do not quite reach where you are. You watch them. They are beautiful in the way that all unreachable things are beautiful. And then you notice the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a quiet room or a still morning. This is something older, something thicker. It settles into the water the way silt settles, slowly, without urgency, finding every hollow and remaining there. The creatures that should be moving through this column of water are still. The small fish that usually form their silver constellations near the thermocline are holding in place, barely finning, barely breathing. The cephalopods that drift through these waters like pale lanterns have gone to the floor. Even the plankton seems to have paused, its slow, luminescent pulse dimming to something barely perceptible. Something has changed in this ocean. You can feel it before you can name it. A quality of attention in the water itself, a held breath that extends from the sunlit surface all the way down to the cold dark below. The Cretaceous Sea, which has never been a quiet place in all the 80 million years of its existence, has gone very, very still. And in that stillness you begin to understand what is missing, not what has arrived, not what threatens, what is gone. The Mosasaurus is no longer moving through these waters, and the ocean, it seems, has noticed. You are drifting now. Let yourself drift. The water around you is warm at the surface and cold below, a gradient as precise and ancient as any law of physics, holding the layers of this Cretaceous world in their proper places like pages in a book no one has written yet. The year, in human terms, would be approximately 75 million years before anything called a human would exist to give years their names. There is no calendar here. There is only the water and the light and the enormous fact of life pressing itself into every available space. The Cretaceous Sea does not resemble any ocean you might know from photographs or memory. It is warmer, first of all, warmer than you might expect because the poles in this era are not frozen wastes but temperate, forested coastlines where the temperature rarely drops below what you would call pleasant. The sea levels are higher too, higher than any human civilization has ever witnessed, flooding the interiors of what will one day be continents, carving shallow inland seas across the hearts of land masses that have not yet decided what shape they mean to be. You are floating in one of the great epicontinental seaways, that vast corridor of water that runs through the middle of what will eventually become North America, a body of water so large and so ancient that it has its own weather patterns, its own currents, its own internal logic. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The Western Interior Seaway, as scientists will one day call it, stretches for nearly 3,000 kilometers at its widest and reaches depths of several hundred meters in its center. The coasts are lined with forests that would look almost familiar to you, cypress and magnolia pressing their roots into the soft sediment, their branches full of early birds that have not quite sorted out the full engineering of flight. Pterosaurs patrol the cliff faces, riding the thermals with a lazy competence that speaks of many millions of years spent perfecting that particular skill. On the land behind the forests, the world is enormous and green and loud, with things that have no names yet. But we are not on the land tonight. Tonight we stay in the water. Tonight we remain in that warm, dark column of sea, in the deep quiet that has settled over the Cretaceous ocean, in the absence of its apex predator, in the absence of the Mosasaurus. The question that the silence is asking is a simple one, and you do not need to answer it. You only need to feel it, the way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm, the way you feel the drop in temperature that means evening is coming. The ocean felt this absence as a physical thing, a change in texture, a shift in the weight of the water itself, and to understand what that absence meant, you need to understand first what the Mosasaurus was. Not as a specimen in a museum, not as a name in a textbook, but as a living thing, a breathing, hunting, enormous fact of nature that spent 80 million years making the Cretaceous sea into its own particular kingdom. So let us begin there. Let us begin at the beginning of the Mosasaurus. Let us begin in the water, where all things in this story begin and end. There is a moment somewhere around 98 million years ago that everything begins. Not with a dramatic plunge, not with a conscious decision, but with something far more ordinary and far more remarkable. A lizard, not particularly large, not particularly distinguished among the hundreds of lizard forms that populate the Cretaceous coastline, moves into shallow water to catch something, a fish perhaps, or a smaller reptile cooling itself at the tide's edge. The reasons are practical and immediate and have nothing to do with the enormous trajectory of evolution that this small movement is about to initiate. The lizard is comfortable in water, more comfortable than it expected to be. Its limbs, which evolved for navigating the root-tangled margins of the forest, find a new purpose in the push and pull of a current. Its smooth, scaled skin, which the sun has been slowly desiccating all day, feels the relief of submersion. The temperature drop as it moves into the shallows is immediate and welcome. The water here in the margins of the great inland sea is warm, but not the scorching warmth of the exposed rock it was resting on minutes ago. It is the warmth of something living. It is the warmth of a medium that contains everything the lizard needs. It catches what it came for. It goes back to the shore, but it returns, and it keeps returning. The ancestors of the Mosasaurus were monitors, close relatives of the great monitor lizards that still exist in some form on the planet today. The Komodo dragons of the Indonesian islands, with their forked tongues and their patient ambush strategies, and their venom-laced saliva that can bring down animals many times their own size. The Nile monitors that patrol the riverbanks of Africa with an almost casual confidence, swimming when they need to, and basking when they choose. The long-tongued, intelligent, predatory lizards that hunt the edges of water and land with a patience that feels almost thoughtful, almost deliberate, almost like the planning that it is not, but that it resembles closely enough to suggest that planning, as a strategy, may be overrated. These ancestral monitors, living along the shores of the Tethys Sea and the edges of the nascent Atlantic in the early late Cretaceous, began a transition that would take millions of years to complete, but would produce, at its end, something that had no precedent in the history of the vertebrates. Not in the history of reptiles, not in the history of anything that had a spine and a brain and a heart. The Mosasaurus was a genuinely new solution to an ancient problem, and the problem it solved was the Cretaceous ocean itself, which was vast and warm and immensely productive, and full of prey that any sufficiently powerful predator could exploit. The transition begins in the feet. This is almost always where great evolutionary transitions begin, in the extremities, in the parts of the body that touch the world most directly. The toes lengthen. The webbing between them thickens and spreads. The ankle joints, which evolved for gripping tree bark and navigating uneven ground, begin to lose some of their fine articulation in exchange for something smoother, more capable of generating thrust through water. The changes are small in any given generation. The difference between one generation and the next would be imperceptible to any observer. But across 10,000 generations, across 100,000, the feet are becoming flippers. Not the crude, paddle-like structures of some early aquatic experiments. True flippers, hydrofoils of the living kind, shaped by the physics of fluid dynamics into exactly the form that the water requires. The tail changes too. A monitor lizard's tail is a weapon and a balance point, a long muscular appendage that can whip with considerable force when the animal feels threatened. It is also a rudder and a counterweight, used in conjunction with the legs to navigate complex terrain. In the water, this tail discovers a different purpose. The lateral undulations that a monitor lizard makes when it runs, that characteristic side-to-side swing of the body, become in the water a form of propulsion. The tail deepens, its muscles thickening on either side of the vertebral column, its end flattening into something that works like a rudder when moved slowly and a propeller when moved fast. The body becomes more streamlined, the neck shortens, the skull elongates. What is happening, though the lizards do not know it and the sea does not care, is the construction of an entirely new kind of animal. The Mosasaurus is not yet born. It will not be born for millions of years. But in these early transitional forms, in animals called Dallosaurus and Rosellosaurus and Clydastes, the blueprint is being drawn in the slow ink of natural selection, line by patient line, correction by patient correction. And what a blueprint it is! Imagine taking the basic architecture of a monitor lizard, which is already an efficient and formidable predator, and then handing it to the sea. The sea has a different set of requirements from the land. Speed, above all, because prey in open water can escape in any direction simultaneously, and a predator that is not fast cannot catch it. Maneuverability, because open water is three-dimensional, and prey uses all three dimensions. The ability to hold one's breath for long periods while pursuing prey through that three-dimensional space, because the air is up and the prey is often down. The ability to regulate body temperature in water, that varies from warm at the surface to very cold below. The sea is a demanding engineer, and it does not accept compromise. Every feature that the early mosasaurs develop is a feature that the sea has specifically requested, in the language of survival and death that the sea has been speaking for 4 billion years. The eyes grow larger. This is the sea's most urgent request. The Cretaceous ocean is full of light near the surface and full of darkness below, and a predator that can operate in both zones is a predator with access to twice the hunting grounds of one that cannot. The mosasaur eye develops a structure called the sclerotic ring, a series of small bones arranged in a ring around the pupil, which allows the eye to maintain its shape under the pressure of deep dives without distorting. A human eye, taken to the same depths, would deform under the pressure and lose its ability to focus. The mosasaur eye does not. It stays sharp. It keeps watching. The sclerotic ring is found today in birds and some other reptiles, and is a remnant of this ancient requirement, the ocean's demand for eyes that work under pressure. The nostrils migrate. In land-dwelling lizards, the nostrils are at the tip of the snout, perfectly positioned for sniffing the air and detecting the chemical signals that the terrestrial world is full of. In the water, this position becomes a liability. Water rushing in at speed would flood the nasal passages and make high-speed swimming painful and disorienting. Over the generations, the nostrils shift backward along the skull, moving toward the top of the head, where they can be briefly exposed at the surface during a fast, shallow breath before the animal dives again. The mosasaur will never need to stop to breathe the way a land animal does. It can breathe on the run, on the surface, without slowing. The exhalation and inhalation happen in a fraction of a second, and then the animal is under again, pursuing whatever it was pursuing before it needed air. The jaws develop in a direction that would seem alarming if you were watching from the shore. The mosasaur jaw is not a single, hinged structure like a human jaw. It has a joint in the middle of the lower jaw, a kinetic joint that allows the two halves of the lower jaw to flex outward slightly when the mouth is open wide. This mechanism, shared with snakes and some other reptiles, allows the mosasaur to swallow prey that is considerably wider than its own resting jaw width. It is an engineering solution to a specific problem. How do you eat large, struggling prey efficiently without letting it escape? The answer is a jaw that can adapt its width on the fly, a jaw that accommodates rather than insists. The prey does not need to be a specific size to fit. The jaw adjusts to the prey. There is another feature of the mosasaur jaw that will not be apparent until paleontologists begin excavating specimens many tens of millions of years in the future. It is the presence of a second row of teeth on the palate. Not the visible teeth, the ones arranged along the edges of the jaws in rows of sharp, conical points. Behind these, on the roof of the mouth, are smaller pterygoid teeth, angled backward like fishhooks. When prey enters the mosasaur's mouth, these palatal teeth prevent it from backing out. The mosasaur needs only to open its jaws, receive whatever it is hunting, and close. The rest is handled by the architecture of the mouth itself. The prey's own escape attempts drive it further onto the palatal teeth. There is no direction that leads to freedom once the mosasaur has closed its mouth around you. This is what the water made from a lizard. This is what 90 million years of selection, generation by generation, small change by small change, produced from an ancestor that was not even particularly comfortable swimming. The result, when it's finally fully realized in the great mosasaurs of the late Cretaceous, is one of the most efficient large predators that has ever existed in any ocean at any time in the history of this planet. Scientists who study living apex predators, the great white shark and the orca and the saltwater crocodile, find themselves using similar language for all of them efficient, economical, precisely calibrated to their environment. The Mosasaurus belongs in this company. It may be the founding member of it. You float here in the warm column of the Cretaceous Sea, and you think about that word, efficient. It is a cold word for something so alive, but there is a particular kind of awe that efficiency inspires when you see it in its natural context, when you understand that every line of the mosasaur's body is a line that the sea drew for specific, functional reasons. Nothing is ornamental, nothing is wasted. Every curve of the skull, every depth of the tail, every angle of the flippers serves the single purpose of moving through water with minimal resistance and maximum effect. It is beautiful the way a very good knife is beautiful, the way a fast river is beautiful, the way any perfectly matched thing is beautiful when it is doing exactly what it was made to do. Outside, whatever room or space you occupy right now is quiet. The night is settling. The world at the surface is doing the slow, ordinary work of becoming still. And here, in this deep column of Cretaceous water, you're beginning to understand what the sea lost when the Mosasaurus went still. Not just a predator, a presence. An entire argument about what a large animal could be, pressed into 15 meters of living muscle and bone and intention, moving through the water with the absolute confidence of an organism that is exactly where evolution intended it to be. Let the understanding settle like silt, slow and complete. There is no hurry here. The Cretaceous Sea does not hurry. It has never needed to. It has always had more time than it needed for anything it wanted to do. And tonight, in the water, it has all the time in the world to show you what it was. By 75 million years ago, the Mosasaurus has arrived at itself. It is finished, in the sense that evolution ever finishes anything, which is to say it has reached a form that the sea has stopped arguing with. The pressures that shaped it are still present, still active, still producing small modifications in every generation, but the broad strokes of the animal have settled into something that will persist, with variations, until the very end of the Cretaceous. You're witnessing the Mosasaurus at the height of its power, at the peak of a lineage that has been building toward this moment for nearly 30 million years. The largest individuals reach lengths of 17-18 meters. Some specimens suggest even larger, though the fragmentary nature of many finds makes precise measurement difficult. To make this comprehensible in the scale of a nighttime imagination, 18 meters is the length of a city bus. It is also the length of 3 large pickup trucks parked end to end. It is, perhaps most usefully, the length of most of the rooms you have ever stood in, laid end to end several times over. The Mosasaurus, at its greatest extent, is not an animal that fits comfortably in most human spaces. It would not fit in a shipping container. It would barely fit in a tennis court. It is the size of a suggestion of how large a living thing can be when the sea has been encouraging it towards size for tens of millions of years. But size alone is not what makes the Mosasaurus what it is. Many large animals are merely large. The elephant seal and the whale shark and the ocean sunfish are large animals that have found their niches through bulk and volume and the particular strategies that bulk allows. The Mosasaurus is large in a particular way, in a way that serves function at every scale. The body is laterally compressed, deeper than it is wide, which reduces drag in the horizontal plane and allows for the fast, eel-like undulation of the tail that provides most of the animal's thrust. The head is enormous relative to the body, heavily built, dense with muscle and bone in the regions around the jaw, lighter and more hollow in the regions above, where elaborate crests and ridges may have served display purposes that we can only guess at now. What did the Mosasaurus look like when it was alive? This is a question that the bones alone cannot fully answer. The soft tissues, the colours and patterns of the skin, the exact texture of the surface, the shape of the tail's trailing edge, all of these require inference, extrapolation, educated guesswork from animals we do know. We have some clues, better clues than we had a generation ago. Fossil skin impressions from close relatives suggest a surface of small, non-overlapping scales, smoother than a snake and less armoured than a crocodile, more like the skin of a modern monitor lizard writ large and modified for hydrodynamic flow. Some specimens preserve traces of what appear to be a fluke on the tail, a vertical or near-vertical fin at the tail's end, that would have increased the propulsive surface area and made the tail beat more efficient. Pigment analysis from some specimens has suggested that at least some mosasaurs may have been dark on the dorsal surface and lighter below. a countershading pattern still used by sharks, dolphins, and many other marine predators because it is devastatingly effective at reducing visibility from both above and below. When seen from above, the dark back blends with the dark deep water. When seen from below, the lighter belly blends with the bright surface light. A predator wearing this pattern is, in effect, invisible from any angle. The physics of light itself conspires to conceal it. Imagine then a body that disappears against the dark water when seen from above and disappears against the pale surface light when seen from below. Imagine a predator that moves through the water in near silence, its body shaped to disturb the water as little as possible, its colouring tuned to vanish against whatever background the observer happens to be against. You're swimming in the Cretaceous Sea and the Mosasaurus is there, somewhere in this column of water, and you would not know it until the moment it decided you should know it. And at that point, the decision would not be yours to revisit. The hunting behaviour of the Mosasaurus can be reconstructed from several lines of evidence. The shape and wear patterns of the teeth tell us about the kinds of prey that were regularly engaged. The contents of stomach regions in exceptionally preserved specimens tell us directly in some cases what the animal ate. The biomechanics implied by the skeleton, the speed that the tail could generate, the force that the jaw could produce, the visual fields that the eye placement allowed, these tell us about the strategic options available to the animal, and the general principles of a large marine predator ecology, studied in living analogues from sharks to orcas, give us a framework within which to interpret all of this specific evidence. What emerges from this reconstruction is a picture of an animal that was above all opportunistic, not in the sense of being disorganized or lazy, but in the deepest sense of the word, an animal that recognized opportunity when it existed in any of its many forms and responded to it with appropriate speed and precision. The Mosasaurus did not have a narrow prey profile. It did not specialize in one kind of prey to the exclusion of others. It was generalist in the way that apex predators tend to be, because being at the top of a food web means having access to everything below you, and specializing in only part of what is available is a strategy that leaves resources unexploited. The teeth tell a particular story. They are conical and slightly curved, designed for gripping rather than for cutting or crushing. A mosasaur tooth is not made to divide prey into pieces. It is made to hold, to penetrate, to secure. The Mosasaurus does not slice its prey into manageable portions before eating. It swallows. The kinetic jaw, the pterygoid teeth on the palate, the elasticity of the throat, all of these features serve a single strategy. Acquire the prey, constrain it, and take it whole or in large portions directly into the gut, where the work of digestion will proceed at its own pace. This strategy is slower than the cutting approach in some ways, but it has the enormous advantage of being difficult to escape from once it has begun. This strategy works across a remarkably broad range of prey sizes. The stomach contents of mosasaur specimens have included fish of various sizes, from small schooling fish to large individual teleosts. They have included ammonites with shells that have been crushed by the force of the bite, the shell fragments mixed with the soft body parts in the stomach region. They have included sea turtles whose shells show the distinctive puncture marks of mosasaur teeth, sometimes healed and sometimes not. They have included mosasaurs of smaller species, a fact that speaks to the pragmatism of the apex predator, which does not privilege its own kind when smaller individuals of the same or related lineages are available, and in one remarkable specimen the remains of what appears to have been a juvenile plesiosaur. The plesiosaur in the mosasaur's stomach is particularly striking. The two groups were not typically in competition, occupying different enough ecological niches that direct conflict was unusual, but the Mosasaurus, as an apex predator, does not organize its hunting around competitive relationships. It organizes its hunting around the simple question, can I catch this, and is it worth the energy expenditure? A juvenile plesiosaur, smaller and less experienced than an adult, and caught perhaps at a disadvantage, answered yes to both questions. The Mosasaurus did not hesitate. The record in the stone is clear. What might it have felt like to be near one? We cannot know directly, but we can reason from the responses of the animals around it. The fossil record shows us an ocean full of creatures that have evolved, over millions of years, to navigate a world that contains the Mosasaurus. Fish with fast acceleration but limited top speed, built for short bursts of escape rather than sustained flight. Ammonites with thick, ridged shells that may have offered some protection against all but the most determined bite. Sea turtles with shells that are demonstrably not always sufficient but are better than nothing. The entire architecture of Cretaceous marine prey ecology is an architecture built in response to the Mosasaurus. And what does the Mosasaurus respond to, in its turn? What in the Cretaceous ocean is large enough, dangerous enough, or unpredictable enough to require the Mosasaurus to be cautious? The honest answer for the largest individuals in the late Cretaceous is almost nothing. There are sharks of considerable size in this ocean, descendants of forms that have been present since long before the first mosasaur ancestor waded into the shallows, and some of these sharks are large and powerful enough to be relevant threats to smaller or juvenile mosasaurs. But the very largest mosasaurs, the adults of the bigger species, the Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the Tylosaurus proriger at its greatest recorded size, these animals occupy a position in their ecosystem that is essentially unchallenged. They are the thing that other things are afraid of. This position has a quality to it that is worth contemplating. The apex predator moves through its world differently from every other organism in that world. Every other organism has, woven into its behavioral responses, a degree of caution that reflects its position in the food web. The fish responds to pressure waves with the tightening of the school. The ammonite descends when chemical signals suggest a large predator nearby. The sea turtle goes still on the bottom and hopes. The smaller mosasaur species, juveniles especially, maintain a spatial awareness that reflects their vulnerability to their larger relatives. Only the adult of the largest species moves through the water without this additional cognitive weight. It does not need to check over its shoulder. There is nothing behind it that represents a threat. This is not a comfortable position, in evolutionary terms, precisely because of its psychological or behavioral simplicity. The apex predator exists in a kind of permanent loneliness at the top of its food web. Nothing hunts it. Nothing competes with it at its own size. It is the terminal point of all the energy that flows through the ecosystem below it, the place where all those chains of eating and being eaten finally end. And this position is, paradoxically, a kind of vulnerability. Because when the world changes, when the base of the food web shifts or shrinks or disappears, the apex predator feels that change last, and then it feels it all at once. But that is not yet. That is still far away, measured in the slow time of the Cretaceous, where 1,000,000 years can pass without anything changing significantly enough to notice. Right now, the Mosasaurus is sovereign. Right now, the Western Interior Seaway belongs to it in the way that a palace belongs to a king. Not because the king built it or even fully understands it, but because the king is the largest fact in it, and everything else arranges itself accordingly. The fish school tightly because the Mosasaurus exists. The ammonites have thick shells because the Mosasaurus exists. The sea turtles grow their shells thick and fast because the Mosasaurus exists. The whole ecology of the Cretaceous ocean is a kind of tribute paid to the fact of the Mosasaurus. And the Mosasaurus, moving through the water with its absolute ease, accepts this tribute without knowing it is being paid. You're floating in that palace now. The water around you holds the particular quality of deep, undisturbed calm that exists only in places where something very large has recently passed through and where everything smaller has frozen in its wake, waiting to see what happens next. The Mosasaurus moved through here some time ago. Its passage is still felt in the water, in the way a wake persists long after the boat has gone, in the way a silence persists in a room after something significant has been said, in the way the Cretaceous sea always felt the presence of the Mosasaurus, whether it was here or not, because the possibility of its presence was itself a shaping force. And then it didn't move anymore. That is the fact at the center of this long, quiet night. That is the question the darkness is holding. You do not need to chase it, only to rest here, in the water, and let the story come to you at its own speed, the way the Cretaceous sea brought everything. On a current you didn't choose, from a direction you didn't expect, with a slowness that felt, somehow, like grace. The Mosasaurus is sovereign, for now. While the world is still the world that made it possible, and has not yet become the world that will make it impossible. For now the king is in the palace, and the palace is the sea. And the sea is very old and very patient, and it has seen kings come and go before, and it will see them again. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Before we can understand what the ocean sounded like without the Mosasaurus, we need to understand what it sounded like with one. This is a task that requires some imagination, because the ears that would eventually record and analyze sound had not yet been invented, and the instruments that measure the acoustic properties of ancient oceans do not exist. But the water is a good keeper of secrets, and a good keeper of clues, and from those clues, from the physics of sound in water, from the behavior of living marine predators, from the fossil records' hints about what animals were present and in what numbers, we can construct something that is not the truth exactly, but is perhaps the shape of the truth. And sometimes the shape of the truth is all we have, and it is enough. Sound travels very differently in water than in air. In air, sound moves at roughly 340 meters per second, slower on cold days, faster on warm ones. In water, sound travels nearly 5 times faster, approximately 1,500 meters per second, and it travels farther, much farther, losing less energy to friction as it goes. A low-frequency sound made by a large animal in the ocean can travel hundreds of kilometers before it becomes too diffuse to detect. The ocean, in this sense, is a much louder place than the land. Not louder to a casual observer standing at the surface with ears adapted for air, but louder in the sense that the ocean is full of information, full of signals travelling in every direction at once, crossing and recrossing, building a 3-dimensional acoustic map of everything that lives within it. Fish here with a structure called the lateral line, a network of pressure-sensitive cells embedded in the skin that runs in a visible line along the side of the body and over the head. This system is exquisitely sensitive to changes in water pressure and to the particle motion that sound creates in the water immediately around it. The lateral line is not quite hearing in the sense that we understand hearing. It is something between touch and hearing, a detection of the mechanical deformation of the water that surrounds the fish, at frequencies and amplitudes that vary by species but that generally cover the lower end of what we would call the sound spectrum. In addition to the lateral line, many fish have an inner ear structure connected to the swim bladder, which acts as a resonance chamber for certain frequencies. The swim bladder amplifies incoming pressure waves and converts them to mechanical vibrations that the ear can detect, extending the fish's acoustic sensitivity into higher frequencies. A fish in the Cretaceous Sea is surrounded by sound information that it is constantly processing, comparing to stored patterns in its nervous system, evaluating for significance. The fish knows in some sense what everything around it sounds like, and it knows when something is wrong. The Cretaceous ocean has its own acoustic signature. It is not the same as the modern ocean. The modern ocean is full of sounds that did not exist in the Cretaceous: the low drone of ship engines, the sonar pulses of submarines, the industrial percussion of offshore drilling platforms, the cacophony of commercial fishing operations. These sounds have altered the acoustic environment of the modern ocean so significantly that we have had to make deliberate effort to find places where the ocean sounds approximately as it once did, in the deep ocean far from shipping lanes, in the polar regions, in the marine protected areas where human activity is restricted. But the modern ocean also provides a rough template for what a rich, warm, shallow to medium sea might sound like when it is full of life and free from industrial noise. Researchers who have studied the acoustic environment of pristine or near-pristine marine ecosystems describe something that is remarkable in its complexity and its richness, a continuous layered sound environment that varies by depth and by time of day and by season and by the particular assemblage of organisms present at any given moment and location. Near the surface of the Cretaceous Sea, the sound is of the movement. The surface itself makes noise when the wind crosses it, a white hissing frequency that scatters across the entire audible spectrum and serves as a kind of acoustic wallpaper, always present, always slightly different, carrying information about wind speed and direction that animals near the surface can read. Below the surface chop, there is the sound of fish schools moving, not individual fish, but the collective displacement of water by thousands of bodies moving in approximate coordination. A school of fish has a sound that is almost more felt than heard, a massed disturbance of the medium that registers as a low, continuous pressure change extending through the water column. Individual fish make sounds, many of them more than most people realize. Some use their swim bladders as resonance chambers, inflating and deflating them rapidly to produce low-frequency drumming that serves both for communication within the species and, incidentally, as an acoustic signature that can be detected by predators. Others create noise by grinding their teeth against each other, producing a rasping sound that varies in frequency and pattern, depending on the species and the individual. Still others push water through their gill chambers at different speeds, creating sounds that serve as territorial signals or mating calls, or simply as byproducts of rapid feeding. The Cretaceous Sea, at any given moment, is a complex acoustic environment, layered and dense and alive with meaning if you know how to read it. The ammonites are quiet, or nearly so. They move through the water by jet propulsion, squeezing water from their mantle cavities in pulses that make a soft, rhythmic sound not unlike a slow heartbeat heard through a wall. Each pulse is a small displacement of water, a tiny pressure wave that radiates outward from the animal in all directions. In isolation, this sound is barely detectable. But the Cretaceous ocean does not contain ammonites in isolation. It contains ammonites in numbers that defy easy visualization. Thousands of individuals in a given volume of water, each producing its small pulse of sound, the pulses overlapping and combining into a low, continuous, almost subliminal throb that is part of the acoustic background of the sea. The sea turtles are nearly silent, their movement a smooth, powerful displacement that leaves behind only the soft turbulence of their passage through the water. Sea turtles have large, flat paddles that generate lift rather than thrust in the way that fish fins do, and the movement of these paddles through the water is graceful and relatively quiet. But sea turtles do produce sounds, detected recently by researchers using sensitive hydrophones near nesting beaches. Low-frequency vocalizations that may serve for communication between adult and embryo, between mates, or between individuals sharing nesting habitat. The Cretaceous sea turtles almost certainly had a similar acoustic repertoire, and the contribution of those large, numerous animals to the ocean's soundscape would have been a soft, low-frequency murmur woven into the background noise. The fish are the noisiest medium-sized animals in the water, various, communicative, always in motion, always producing signals, always responding to signals. The Cretaceous Sea has fish in it in numbers that are difficult to imagine now, in an ocean that has been commercially fished for centuries and that carries a fraction of the fish biomass it once supported. The late Cretaceous fish fauna includes teleosts, the advanced bony fish that will eventually come to dominate the modern ocean in early forms. It includes large predatory fish in the Xiphactinus group, aggressive, fast-swimming animals that hunt in the same water column as the Mosasaurus, and that have been found preserved in the remarkable act of having swallowed fish larger than would seem anatomically possible. The Cretaceous Sea is full of fish trying to eat each other, producing the various sounds that eating and being eaten generate. But there is something else in the acoustic landscape of the Cretaceous ocean, something that operates at a frequency lower than most of the other sounds, lower than the fish chorus, lower than the surface noise, something that is felt as much as heard. It is the sound, though calling it a sound may not quite capture it, of very large animals moving through the water. The Mosasaurus at cruising speed produces a low-frequency bow wave, a pressure pulse that travels ahead of it through the water and arrives at the sensory organs of nearby animals before the Mosasaurus itself arrives. This pressure sense is detected not through ears but through the lateral line system. Fish cannot hear the Mosasaurus coming in the conventional sense. They feel it. The water changes before the predator arrives. The pressure increases in a way that fish have learned, over millions of generations, to recognize and respond to. Not as a conscious recognition, not as a thought that occurs in a brain capable of thoughts, but as a response encoded so deeply in the nervous system that it precedes any possibility of deliberation. When the Mosasaurus is moving through the water at hunting speed, the sonic signature changes. The tailbeat becomes more powerful, more defined, each stroke sending a stronger pulse of pressure outward through the water. The pressure pulse sharpens. There is a slight but detectable change in the local water current as the displaced water moves out to the sides of the oncoming predator. And around the Mosasaurus, in a radius that extends perhaps 30 or 40 meters in all directions, the behavioral response of prey animals is immediate and specific. Fish tighten their schools, compressing from loose, drifting aggregations into tight spherical formations, where each individual presses against its neighbors for the protection of numbers. The ammonites descend, pulling down into deeper water where the light is less and the Mosasaurus may not pursue. The sea turtles, depending on their size and what experience has taught them, either go very still and hold near the bottom, or they swim hard toward the shallows where the Mosasaurus's size becomes a disadvantage in maneuvering. What does this orchestrated response sound like? It sounds, in aggregate, like a diminuendo, a lowering of volume, a drawing in. The fish that were producing their various signals and sounds reduce their output, not from any conscious decision to be quiet, but from the physiological response to threat that includes the cessation of non-essential activities, and signalling is a non-essential activity when a very large predator is nearby. The movement in the water column that comes from constant normal biological activity slows and quiets. The Cretaceous ocean, in the presence of the Mosasaurus, becomes more careful, it edits itself. And this editing is itself a sound. Silence has a texture. The absence of the fish chorus is audible as an absence, a gap in the acoustic fabric of the water that is as recognizable to the inhabitants of the sea as a sudden quiet in a forest is recognizable to the animals of the land. Every forest creature knows the silence that means something large is moving through the undergrowth. Every ocean creature, over millions of years of learning, has come to know the particular silence that means the Mosasaurus is here. It is a silence with a specific quality, a specific texture, a specific emotional weight. If emotions can be attributed to animals whose emotional lives we do not fully understand. Have you ever noticed how a room changes when someone important walks in? Not a celebrity, not a performer, but someone whose presence simply rearranges the space around them, someone whose arrival you feel before you see them. The room doesn't necessarily go quiet, but the quality of the noise in it changes. Conversations shift, postures adjust. The collective attention of everyone in the room reorganizes itself around the new arrival's presence. The Cretaceous ocean experiences something like this every time the Mosasaurus enters a new section of the seaway. The acoustic and behavioral environment reorganizes itself around the predator's presence, not in deference, not in awe, but in the cold biological calculation of survival. So what happens when that presence is removed? What happens when the thing that everything has been organized around is suddenly, without warning, no longer there? What happens to the room when the important person leaves? What happens to the reorganized acoustic environment when the factor that organized it is gone? You already know the answer, in the way that you know things in dreams, in the way that understanding arrives not as argument, but as direct apprehension. The silence that settles into the Cretaceous ocean, in the absence of the Mosasaurus, is not simply the absence of the Mosasaurus's sounds, it is the absence of the silence that the Mosasaurus created. It is the absence of the careful, edited quiet that the ocean maintained in deference to its apex predator. It is, in other words, a completely different kind of silence from the one you might expect. An understanding that silence, that particular, specific, ecologically loaded silence, is what this long night in the deep water has been building toward. To understand what the Cretaceous ocean lost when the Mosasaurus went still, you need to hold in your mind a fact that is counterintuitive and strange. An ecosystem organized around an apex predator is not a worse ecosystem for having that predator. It is, in many ways, a better one, more ordered, more efficient, more diverse in the ways that matter most to the long-term health of the system. The Mosasaurus, in hunting everything beneath it in the food web, did not merely take, it gave shape, and the shape it gave was the shape of the entire Cretaceous ocean, as surely as the shore gives shape to the sea that meets it. Consider what it means for a fish to live in a world that contains the Mosasaurus, not as an abstraction, not as a concept in a natural history documentary, but as a daily, immediate biological fact. The Mosasaurus is always present as a possibility. It may be nearby or it may be 50 kilometers away, but the fish cannot know this with certainty, and the uncertainty itself is a force that acts on the fish's behavior in every moment of its life. The fish must balance the need to eat against the risk of being visible while eating. The fish must balance the need to be in the warmer, food-rich surface waters against the risk that the surface is where large predators also hunt. The fish must balance the benefits of schooling, which offers protection in numbers, against the fact that a school is also a larger, more easily detected acoustic and chemical signal than a solitary individual. These trade-offs, running as a constant background calculation through the nervous system of every fish in the Western Interior Seaway, are not trivial. They shape the fish's body. Over millions of generations, the fish that survives in a Mosasaurus-containing ocean is not simply the fastest fish, or the most camouflaged fish, or the deepest diving fish. It is the fish that has found the best solution to the specific problem of living with the Mosasaurus. And that solution is written into its genome and expressed in its shape and its behavior and the specific timing of its daily activities. The fish is, in a very real sense, a partial portrait of the Mosasaurus, defined as much by what it has evolved to avoid as by what it has evolved to pursue. The schooling behavior of fish in the Cretaceous Sea is, in a real sense, a technology invented in response to the Mosasaurus, and to the long line of large marine predators that preceded the Mosasaurus in the ocean's history. Schools work because a predator that attacks a school of fish is statistically less likely to catch any individual fish than a predator that attacks a solitary individual. The confusion created by hundreds or thousands of identical-looking fish moving in the same direction causes a brief but critical hesitation in the predator's targeting system. The fish on the outer edges of the school experience a higher predation pressure than the fish in the interior, which creates a constant competitive jostling for interior positions that keeps the school's internal structure dynamic and alert. The school as a whole responds to threats faster than any individual could, because the fish on the edges that detect the predator's pressure wave communicate their alarm through the rapid ripple of a collective change in direction, a murmuration of the sea that is both defensive and beautiful. The Mosasaurus, by hunting fish schools for millions of years, has shaped those schools into what they are. The tight formations, the rapid collective responses, the tendency to compress toward the center when threatened, the preference for positions that offer the protection of other bodies. All of these are features that have been selected for by the specific hunting techniques of the Mosasaurus, and the schools, by being shaped in this way, have in turn shaped the Mosasaurus's hunting techniques. A predator whose prey schools tightly needs different strategies from a predator whose prey is solitary. It needs speed to strike before the school can react. It needs to target the edges, where individuals are most exposed. It needs to separate individuals from the school's protective compression. The Mosasaurus has learned all of these things, in the evolutionary sense, and the fish have responded to each learning by adapting further. The ammonites are another example of this mutual calibration. These cephalopods, distant relatives of the modern nautilus and somewhat more distant relatives of the squid and octopus, are extraordinarily abundant in the Cretaceous ocean. Some species have shells the size of a dinner plate, others are no larger than a coin. The diversity of ammonite forms in the late Cretaceous is remarkable, dozens of species occupying different niches within the water column, some feeding on plankton near the surface, others hunting small prey in the midwaters, still others occupying the deep, dark margins of the seaway, where the temperature is cold and the pressure is significant, and the light from the surface barely reaches. The shape of an ammonite's shell, the tightness of its coiling, the thickness of its walls, the elaborateness of the ridges and keels on its surface, all of these features represent solutions to the problem of surviving in an ocean that contains the Mosasaurus. A tightly coiled, thick-walled shell offers better protection against a mosasaur bite than a loosely coiled, thin-walled one. But a thick-walled shell is heavier, which affects the ammonite's buoyancy and its energy expenditure in maintaining its position in the water column. There are trade-offs everywhere, and the trade-offs have been negotiated by the pressure of predation over millions of years into the specific set of shell designs that the Cretaceous ammonite fauna exhibits. Each design is a compromise, a point on a curve between the ideal shell for maximum protection and the ideal shell for minimum weight and maximum efficiency. When paleontologists find mosasaur teeth embedded in ammonite shells, and they find this with some regularity in the chalk beds of Europe and the shales of North America, they are looking at a record of individual failures. Moments when the ammonite's shell was not quite thick enough, or when the Mosasaurus bit in exactly the wrong spot where the shell was thinnest, or when the ammonite was simply unlucky. But they are also looking at the inverse of these individual failures, the collective success of all the ammonites whose shells were thick enough, whose position was lucky, whose speed was sufficient. Evolution records its successes through the bodies of the living. The fossils record only the failures, but the failures tell you what the successes were designed to resist. The sea turtles of the Cretaceous ocean are a special case, worthy of extended consideration. Archaic forms much larger than modern sea turtles, some reaching nearly 4 meters in length, With shells that are massively constructed by any comparison to their descendants, these animals spend their entire lives in the water, except for the brief, vulnerable moments of egg-laying on beaches that are exposed to all the ordinary dangers of the terrestrial world. Their shells are a response to predation pressure that goes back far beyond the Mosasaurus, to earlier reptilian predators, to earlier sharks, to the general proposition that a hard outer casing is a useful thing to have when you're a slow-moving, nutritious animal in a world full of things that would like to eat you. But the Mosasaurus, with its powerful jaws and palatal teeth, is not deterred by the sea turtle's shell in the way that earlier predators may have been. Mosasaur specimens have been found with healed bite wounds on their shells, evidence that the turtle survived the encounter because the shell held, and this survival implies that the Mosasaurus did not always succeed in breaking through. There is apparently a threshold shell thickness above which the Mosasaurus does not bother or cannot penetrate economically. The cost of cracking a very thick shell may exceed the caloric reward of the meal inside, and the Cretaceous sea turtles, over millions of years of selection, have been pushed toward and past that threshold by precisely this economic calculation playing out in the life and death of their ancestors. The relationship between the Mosasaurus and the sea turtles is not simply predator and prey. It is a long negotiation, conducted in the currency of survival and death, across a timescale that makes all human negotiations look brief and tentative. The Mosasaurus says, "I can break shells up to this thickness." The sea turtle says, "I can grow shells this thick." The Mosasaurus says, "Then I will focus on the younger ones, the smaller ones, the ones whose shells have not yet reached full thickness." The sea turtle says, "Then I will grow fast, very fast, in the years before I'm safe, sacrificing other investments to get past the vulnerable size range as quickly as possible." And the sea turtle does grow fast. Its juvenile growth rate is extraordinary among reptiles, pushing it past the vulnerable size range with a speed that reflects the evolutionary history of exactly this threat. All of this complexity and interdependence and mutual calibration exists because the Mosasaurus exists. Remove the Mosasaurus, and you remove the pressure that created all of these shapes and behaviors and strategies. The ecosystem does not immediately fall apart. It is too robust for that, too full of redundancies and alternative relationships and organisms that can shift their ecological roles when the pressures change. But it begins, slowly, to change. The trade-offs that were calibrated around the Mosasaurus begin to lose their precision. The shell thicknesses that were exactly right for a world with mosasaurs are suddenly more than necessary, which means energy is being spent on armor that is no longer required. The schooling behaviors that were perfectly tuned to the specific threat profile of the Mosasaurus are responding to a threat that is no longer there. There is a concept in ecology called a trophic cascade, and it describes exactly this kind of ripple effect that propagates through an ecosystem when a key species is added or removed. The classic terrestrial example involves wolves and elk and willows. Remove the wolves, and the elk, freed from predation pressure in the valleys and riverbanks, overgraze the willows, remove the willows, and the riverbanks erode the riverbanks, and the stream channels widen and warm the stream channels, and the fish that require cold, clear water decline. The removal of the wolf at the top of the system reaches all the way down to the fish through a chain of ecological consequences that no simple analysis of predator-prey relationships would have predicted. The trophic cascade set in motion by the removal of the Mosasaurus from the Western Interior Seaway would have been of a similar character, though more complex because the Mosasaurus was more deeply embedded in a more complex ecosystem than any wolf in any modern landscape. The cascade would have begun in the behavior of the immediate prey species and propagated outward and downward through the food web, changing the competitive relationships between species that didn't interact directly with the Mosasaurus, changing the distribution of biomass across the water column, changing the chemical environment of the seaway through the altered patterns of feeding and decomposition that accompanied the behavioral shifts. The seaway was already under stress from the KPG event. The loss of its apex predator added another perturbation to a system that was struggling to maintain its coherence. But right now, in this particular moment in the Cretaceous Sea, the Mosasaurus is still present. The fish are still schooled tightly. The ammonites still carry their thick-walled shells. The sea turtles still grow fast in their vulnerable years. The entire ecology of the seaway is organized around the fact that the Mosasaurus is here and has been here and will be here. The deep biological intelligence of the ecosystem, if an ecosystem can be said to have intelligence, which perhaps it cannot but which the accumulated product of millions of years of selection resembles very closely, is still operating on the assumption that the Mosasaurus is a permanent feature of the world. It is not wrong exactly to operate on that assumption. The Mosasaurus has been a permanent feature of this world for nearly 80 million years. It has survived every perturbation that the late Cretaceous has thrown at it. It has survived disease and drought and changes in sea level and shifts in the prey base and competition from other large predators. The ecosystem's assumption that it will continue is based on the best available evidence. The assumption is reasonable, it just happens to be about to be violated. We do not know precisely what killed the last Mosasaurus. This is an honest admission that paleontology makes readily, even while it can say with confidence what killed the non-avian dinosaurs, what ended the ammonites, what closed the chapter on the plesiosaurs and the pterosaurs and the dozens of other lineages that disappeared at the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, 66 million years ago. We know the mechanism, we know the cause. What we do not know is the specific moment, the specific individual, the specific location in the Western Interior Seaway, or the Tethys Ocean, or the chalk seas of what is now Western Europe, where the last Mosasaurus drew its last breath and sank into a darkness from which no Mosasaurus would ever resurface. But we can imagine the night. Not the specific night, not with any pretense of literal accuracy, but the kind of night that the end would have been. We can approach it the way you approach a dream, with the understanding that the details may not be precisely true, but the feeling, the essential quality of the thing, is as true as anything can be when you're trying to understand something that happened 66 million years ago and left no one alive to witness it. 66 million years ago. The sky above the Western Interior Seaway is darker than it has been in living memory, darker than it has been in geologic memory that extends back millions of years. Not the ordinary darkness of night, which has a softness to it, which carries the light of stars even when clouds cover the moon, and makes the dark feel inhabited by something other than absence. This darkness is different. It is a darkness with substance, with weight, with a texture that the few animals still alive and watching from the surface can perhaps feel against their eyes. The sky's full of fine particles, aerosols of vaporized rock and sulfur compounds that the asteroid impact injected into the stratosphere weeks ago, ash from fires that are still burning on every continent simultaneously, soot from the combustion of 100 million years of accumulated organic material. The sun is there, somewhere above the layer of particulate matter. It has not gone out. The nuclear reactions at its core continue exactly as they have continued for 4.5 billion years, producing the same energy, generating the same warmth. But that warmth and light cannot get through, or cannot get through in any useful sense. What reaches the surface of the seaway is a dim, directionless glow, something like twilight, something less than twilight, a luminosity without a source, not enough for photosynthesis, barely enough to cast shadows. The temperature has been falling, not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily and without reversal, in a way that the animals of the Cretaceous ocean would feel as a metabolic constraint, as a slowing of the chemical processes that keep them alive and responsive. The Western Interior Seaway, which has been warm for as long as any lineage alive can remember, is cooling from the surface down. The thermocline, the boundary between the warm surface water and the cold, deep water, which has been a consistent feature of the seaway for millions of years, is becoming less distinct. The contrast between warm and cold is diminishing. The seaway is becoming more uniformly cold. The Mosasaurus is not fully cold-blooded, not in the way that a lizard on a rock is cold-blooded. Evidence suggests a degree of metabolic elevation, a capacity for maintaining body temperature somewhat above ambient, which is one of the reasons the Mosasaurus can be active through the cooler deep waters it sometimes dives into. Researchers have found evidence of elevated metabolic rates in mosasaur isotopic chemistry, in the growth patterns recorded in their bones, in the features of their circulatory systems that suggest they were producing more internal heat than a fully ectothermic reptile would. The Mosasaurus runs warm, for a reptile, but this capacity has limits, and the world is now consistently cooler than those limits were designed to accommodate. In these conditions, the Mosasaurus moves more slowly, not because it has lost the physical capacity for speed, Its muscles are still powerful, its tail still capable of the driving undulation that can propel it through the water with terrifying acceleration. It moves more slowly because its metabolism is running at a lower rate, because the chemical reactions that convert food into movement are proceeding at a pace calibrated for a warmer ocean, and the ocean is no longer warm in the way it was. Its hunting efficiency has declined. Not to zero, not yet, but to a level that makes feeding harder and makes the cost of a failed hunting attempt more significant than it used to be. A Mosasaurus in peak condition could afford to fail. A Mosasaurus in reduced condition cannot. The prey animals are also slower. This is a small comfort, and it is a cold comfort, because the prey is not merely slower, it is also scarcer. The phytoplankton that formed the base of the food web has been devastated by the darkness. Without sunlight, photosynthesis stops. Without photosynthesis, the phytoplankton dies, or goes dormant, or simply fails to reproduce at the rate that maintains population density. The zooplankton that fed on the phytoplankton has crashed behind it. The small fish that fed on the zooplankton are thinner and fewer. The medium fish that fed on the small fish are thinner still. The seaway is running out of food from the bottom up, in the way that a building runs out of power from the generator up, each floor going dark in sequence. The Mosasaurus is hungry. This is the underlying fact of the night we are imagining. It has been hungry for longer than it would normally be hungry, because the hunting has been difficult, because the prey is less numerous than it was, because the conditions that allowed the Cretaceous food web to be so extraordinarily productive have been systematically dismantled by the ongoing atmospheric catastrophe. The Mosasaurus does not understand this in any conceptual way. It does not have access to the geological perspective that would allow it to recognize its situation as part of a mass extinction event. It only knows that it is hungry, and that the water is cold, and that the prey that it can sense through the lateral line pressure receptors along its flanks is not where it usually is, and that the effort of pursuing it seems, lately, disproportionate to the reward. The Mosasaurus we are imagining is one of the last. Not the last, not necessarily, because the extinction of a species does not happen all at once in any single location. Different populations in different parts of the world's oceans may have held on for different amounts of time after the impact, depending on local conditions, on the specific mixture of species in the local food web, on the depth and temperature of the local water, on any number of factors that the imprecise resolution of the fossil record cannot distinguish between. But this individual is one of the last, somewhere in the late stages of a lineage that has been declining for months, as the world's oceans have gotten progressively colder and darker and less capable of supporting the enormous caloric needs of very large marine reptiles. What draws the Mosasaurus toward the surface on this particular night is impossible to say with certainty. Perhaps a pressure change in the water column that its lateral line interprets as the movement of prey. Perhaps the thermal gradient, the warmer layer near the surface that still exists, attenuated but present, above the deeper cold. Perhaps nothing more directed than the general tendency of a hungry animal to move, to search, to keep trying, because stopping means accepting defeat, and the biology of a predator does not accept defeat easily. The Mosasaurus surfaces. It breathes. The air it takes in has a quality that is different from the air of any previous breath it has drawn in its lifetime. A particular quality, a slight acidity, a faintness of the oxygen content. Because the photosynthetic organisms that produce the planet's oxygen have been significantly reduced in the ongoing darkness, and the atmospheric chemistry is slowly shifting in response. The breath is unsatisfying in a way that the Mosasaurus cannot analyze but can feel. It breathes again. The second breath is not better. The surface of the water is different too. It has a stillness that is wrong. The normal small turbulence of biological activity at the surface, the fish jumping to escape smaller predators, the seabirds that have not entirely disappeared yet diving for whatever they can find, the splash and scatter of a living ocean surface is diminished. The surface is too quiet. The Mosasaurus, whose entire existence has been calibrated to the sounds and sensations of the Cretaceous ocean at its most productive, registers this quiet as wrong, even if wrong is not a category its nervous system can explicitly formulate. And then the Mosasaurus does something that it has not done in its life. It goes still, not the predatory stillness of an animal preparing to strike, which is a tightly controlled, alert stillness where every muscle is primed and ready, and the eyes are tracking and the lateral line is reading every pressure change, not the watchful, conserving stillness of an apex predator resting between hunts, where the breathing is regular and the flippers make small corrections and the world is being monitored even in repose. A different stillness, an involuntary stillness, the stillness of a cold engine that has finally reached the lower limit of its operating temperature. This stillness spreads from the tail, which stops its periodic sculling, through the body, which loses the slight constant adjustments of muscle that maintain position in the water column, to the head, which ceases its slow scanning movement. The Mosasaurus, for the first time in its life, is not moving toward anything. It is not moving away from anything. It is simply in the water, floating, its vast body maintained at the surface by the buoyancy of its flesh and the slow residual warmth of its still metabolizing tissues, the last light of a furnace that is running out of fuel. How long does this stillness last before it becomes permanent? Not long. The metabolic cascade, once begun, has a momentum of its own. The Mosasaurus's breathing slows, the gap between one breath and the next extends, the quality of the breath, the depth of it, the efficiency with which oxygen is exchanged for carbon dioxide diminishes. There is, in the last moments, a quality of something like the stillness you feel at the edge of sleep, that particular sensation of the body releasing its grip on consciousness, of the effort of maintenance becoming too great to sustain, of the world becoming, not frightening, just very quiet and very far away. The Mosasaurus sinks slowly. The buoyancy of its body, which kept it at the surface while there was still metabolic heat to expand its tissues, diminishes as the core temperature equalizes with the surrounding water. It goes down gently, without drama, without the thrashing that would accompany a violent death. The water closes over it. The surface where it breathed its last returns to whatever it was before, a faint disturbance, a ripple spreading outward in concentric rings that the dim, directionless light barely illuminates. Nothing. And the sea, the ancient Cretaceous sea that has held and been shaped by and organized itself around the fact of the Mosasaurus for nearly 80 million years, receives its apex predator back into itself. The Mosasaurus was made of the sea, in a sense that goes deeper than metaphor. The calcium in its bones was dissolved from ancient seabed rock and concentrated through the food web into its teeth and skeleton. The protein in its muscles was assembled from amino acids that began their journey as nitrogen compounds in the water column. The oxygen in its blood was last breathed from the sky over a Cretaceous sea that no longer exists. The sea takes all of this back. It always does, in the end. The sea takes everything back. There are no witnesses. This is important to establish and to sit with, because the lack of witnesses is itself a fact about this kind of ending. The ending of the Mosasaurus occurs without audience, without ceremony, without the kind of dramatic punctuation that human narratives tend to demand for their significant moments. The sea does not pause. The darkness does not deepen at the moment of death. There is no sound distinguishable from the ordinary sounds of the ocean at night, muted now, dimmed by the cold and the ash-laden sky, but continuous, ongoing, the same complex acoustic fabric that the sea has been weaving for millions of years without interruption. The universe does not register the death of the last Mosasaurus any more than it registered the death of the first. The universe is not paying attention in that way. What changes, in the hours after, is not perceptible in any single moment. It accumulates. The absence begins to propagate through the ecosystem, the way a thermal change propagates through a body of water, not immediately apparent at the surface, but working its way through the layers until it has altered the character of the whole. Change of this kind is not dramatic. It is patient. It moves at the speed of biology, which is slower than the speed of physics but faster than the speed of geology, and it moves whether or not anyone is watching. The most immediate effect is behavioral. The fish that were in the vicinity of the Mosasaurus's final position, fish that had been holding in their cold water stillness, the metabolic equivalent of huddling against the chill, begin after some time to resume movement. The movement is tentative at first, exploratory, the kind of movement that an animal makes when it's testing whether a threat is still present. The lateral line of each fish is reading the water constantly, and the reading has changed. The pressure signature that means large predator nearby has faded. Not all at once, not cleanly, but the signal is diminishing, and the fish are responding to its diminishment with the caution of animals that have learned, over millions of generations, not to trust the absence of threat signals too quickly. A few individuals drift in one direction, pause, drift in another. The school, which had been compressed into a tight ball of mutual protection, begins to loosen slightly at its edges. Not dramatically, not confidently, but the loosening is real, and the loosening itself becomes a signal. When the fish at the edges of the school begin to drift slightly further apart, the fish that are adjacent to them receive this information through the lateral line. The pressure from the bodies around them, the pressure that tight schooling produces, decreases fractionally. This decrease is interpreted through the nervous system's rapid pattern matching as the fish around me are no longer maximally compressed, which means the threat level is not at maximum. This cascading signal propagates through the school, from the edges inward, from the periphery to the centre. The individuals at the centre, which were the most protected and therefore the most insulated from the predator's direct presence, are the last to relax. They have been shielded from the direct pressure information by the bodies of the fish around them. They relax only when the fish around them relax, a second-hand signal, information once removed. But it reaches them. Everything reaches the centre of the school eventually. The school is a democracy of sensory information, even if some members receive the information before others. Within an hour of the Mosasaurus's stillness, the school has moved. Not a directional movement, not a purposeful migration toward food or away from threat, but the resumption of the slow, drifting movement that characterizes a resting school of fish in the absence of immediate pressure. This movement is almost imperceptible from outside the school, a slight shift in orientation, a gentle spread of the school's outer boundary. The school takes up marginally more space than it did an hour ago. Marginally. The measurement is in centimetres. It is also, in another register in the Register of Evolutionary History and Ecological Significance, enormous. Marginally more space. This is how the reorganisation of the Cretaceous ocean begins. Not with a dramatic expansion into the predator's former territory, not with a burst of feeding and reproduction, not with the triumphant arrival of new species into newly vacated niches. With a school of fish that is no longer sure it needs to be quite as compact as it was, and that expresses this uncertainty through a marginal increase in the space between individuals. The ocean's adjustment to the absence of its apex predator is measured not in kilometres but in centimetres, not in hours but in years, not in the bold strokes of catastrophic change but in the fine, continuous handwriting of ecological adjustment. The ammonites are slower to respond. Their sensory capabilities are different from those of fish. They do not have a lateral line system in the same sense. What they have are chemoreceptors, sensitive to compounds dissolved in the water, and these chemoreceptors have been detecting the Mosasaurus's chemical signature for as long as any of these ammonites have existed. The Mosasaurus produces metabolic byproducts, as all living animals do, and these compounds, even at the trace levels at which they existed in the vast volume of the Western Interior Seaway, were detectable by animals whose survival depended on detecting them. For millions of generations, the ammonite nervous system has been running a continuous chemical surveillance of the water around it, looking for the specific mix of compounds that means Mosasaurus nearby. As the Mosasaurus's chemical signature fades from the water, diluted by current and time, the ammonites begin their own tentative adjustment. Some individuals ascend slightly from the depths to which they had retreated. Not to the surface, not yet, not with any confidence or celebration, but upward, toward the warmer, food-richer waters of the upper water column that they had been avoiding when the Mosasaurus's presence made those waters dangerous. The ascent is gradual. It is not a confident return to former territory. It is a cautious inquiry, a careful question asked of the water above. Is it safe to come up now? The water above does not answer in any way that the ammonite can interpret as a definitive yes. The absence of the Mosasaurus's chemical signature is suggestive, but absence is not the same as safety, and the ammonite's nervous system, which has been calibrated by millions of years of selection to treat absence of signal as insufficient evidence for safety, does not simply turn off the avoidance response. The response fades slowly as the absence of the signal accumulates over time, as hour after hour passes without the chemical confirmation of a predator nearby. It is the cautious confidence of an animal that has been safe for long enough to begin to believe that the safety might be real. By the second hour after the Mosasaurus's stillness, some ammonites have ascended to within 20 metres of the surface. By the fourth hour, some are visible in the dim light of the particulate-filtered sky, their coiled shells catching what little luminosity the night provides and reflecting it back in a faint, ghostly shimmer. They are not feeding aggressively. They are hovering, testing. In another time, in a warmer world with more light and more food, this tentative presence at the surface would quickly convert into active hunting, into the efficient pursuit of the zooplankton and small fish that occupy the upper water column. But the world is cold and dark and the prey is sparse, and the ammonite's ascent achieves a quiet kind of pointlessness, a reaching toward a resource that is not quite there anymore. What is the sound of the ocean in these first hours after the Mosasaurus? It is the sound of careful emergence. It is the sound of animals testing boundaries that they were not sure existed until very recently. It is the sound of a held breath beginning, slowly, not all at once, to be released. If you could stand at the surface of the Western Interior Seaway and listen to the water, you would not hear a dramatic change. You would hear, if you were very attentive, a slight increase in the frequency of fish movement sounds, a slight change in the distribution of acoustic energy in the water column. The silence is no longer quite as evenly distributed as it was. There are notes in it now, quiet ones, tentative ones, but notes nonetheless. On the sea floor, 60 meters below the surface, the body of the Mosasaurus has come to rest. The cold has slowed bacterial decomposition to a crawl, but the process has begun, as it always begins, the slow return of the complex biological molecule to its constituent parts. The first scavengers, small sharks and bottom-feeding fish, have found the body, alerted by the chemical plume that diffuses upward through the water column. They feed at the margins cautiously, checking often for the threat that their instinct insists should be present before they approach something this large. The Mosasaurus was always the largest thing in these waters. The largest things in these waters do not typically lie still on the bottom. Something is wrong with this picture, and the scavengers know it, in the only way they know anything, through the pattern recognition of their nervous systems reading the environmental signals. The threat does not materialize. The body is still, the ocean around it is still, and the scavengers, after long minutes of hesitation, commit to feeding. This is the last role the Mosasaurus plays in the ecosystem it shaped for 80 million years. Not apex predator, not organizer of ecological relationships, not the thing around which everything else arranges itself. In its final act, the Mosasaurus is simply food. It is energy, returning to the system. The calcium that was its bones will become available to the organisms that dissolve it. The protein of its muscles will feed the scavengers. The chemical energy stored in its tissues will be consumed and used and eventually dissipated back into the environment from which it came. The Mosasaurus, which ate so much of the Western Interior Seaway over the course of its life and its lineage's 80 million year history, is being eaten now, giving back in the way that all living things eventually give back everything they have taken. The gift is not given consciously, not with any sense of reciprocity or return. It is simply the final expression of the principle that energy flows through ecosystems, never staying in any one place, always moving, always being converted from one form to another, always returning to the medium from which it was originally borrowed. You are still here in the dark water. The water is still warm, warmer than the air above it, warmer than the land at any latitude in this darkening world. The current that has been moving in the same direction for thousands of years is still moving. The stars, invisible behind the aerosol layer, are still there. Everything continues. The Mosasaurus is on the floor of an ancient sea, and in the water above it something is changing, slowly, carefully, without fanfare. The ocean is trying to remember what it is without its apex predator. It will take a very long time to find out. Here is something worth holding carefully. The fish did not know. Not in any sense that we would recognize as knowing. The fish had no category for the absence of the Mosasaurus, no mental model of the apex predator that could be updated with information about its death. The fish operated on signals and the absence of signals, on chemical gradients and pressure waves and the visual information of the dimming ash-filtered light. And in the days after the Mosasaurus's stillness, the signals continued to carry their old meanings for a while. The pressure pattern that meant Mosasaurus nearby had faded. The chemical signature had diluted. But the behavioral programs encoded in the fish's nervous system, the programs that said compress the school and descend when uncertain and pause before feeding, these programs did not have an off switch. They faded gradually, as the conditions that had sustained them for millions of years faded gradually, the way a habit fades when the reason for the habit disappears, slowly and unevenly and never completely. There is something in this that feels familiar, even from a human distance. How many behaviors do we carry because the pressures that created them no longer exist? How much of what we do in any given day is a response to threats or opportunities that have already changed or disappeared? We are in some sense always operating on old information, the nervous system always a few steps behind the world it is navigating, relying on patterns that were laid down in earlier conditions and may or may not be perfectly calibrated to the present moment. The fish in the Cretaceous Sea, in the days after the Mosasaurus's death, are navigating this gap between old programming and changed reality. They are not unique in this. They are simply more transparent about it, their behavioral responses more directly readable in the physical compression and expansion of the school. The schools spread out, not dramatically, not all at once, but the density of the schooling behavior decreases over days and weeks, as each individual fish's calculation of the trade-off between the protection of tight schooling and the inefficiency of tight schooling shifts fractionally in the direction of looseness. Looser schools can feed more efficiently, because the individuals are not interfering with each other's access to food resources. The fish at the periphery of the school can dart outward to take a small prey item and return to the school's protection, without pushing through dense rows of other bodies. The fish in the interior of the school can see potential food items in the water above them without them being taken first by the fish between them and the surface. In a world where food is becoming scarcer, as the darkness and cold reduce the productivity of the phytoplankton that sits at the base of the food web, the efficiency of feeding matters more than it did when food was abundant. When food is everywhere, and the challenge is not finding it, but deciding which of the many available items to eat first, the inefficiency of tight schooling is an acceptable trade-off for the protection it offers. When food is sparse, and the challenge is finding enough of it to sustain yourself through the cold, the inefficiency of tight schooling is a tax that diminishing resources cannot support. The schools loosen partly because the predator pressure has decreased, and partly because the food pressure, the pressure to feed more efficiently, has increased. Both forces push in the same direction. The fish are navigating a changed world. Every day is slightly different from the day before. The light is slightly different, the temperature is slightly different, the food is slightly different in its quantity and distribution. And the fish, with their extraordinary capacity for real-time behavioral adjustment, are adjusting. Not with any awareness of the larger context, not with any sense of the geological catastrophe that is unfolding around them, only with the moment-to-moment responsiveness to signal and environment that natural selection has spent millions of years perfecting. The species that will make it through this period of darkness and cold are the ones whose adjustments are most accurate, whose behavioral flexibility is greatest, whose metabolic requirements are lowest and most easily met from what the diminished ocean can still provide. These are not necessarily the most impressive species, the largest or the most spectacularly adapted. They are often the smallest, the most generalist, the least specialized. The small, teleost fish that can eat almost anything, that can survive on very little, that can slow down when the temperature drops and speed up again when it warms. These are the fish that will carry the lineage through the filter of the KPG event and into the Paleogene ocean that will eventually replace the Cretaceous one. What does this look like from inside the school? Imagine being one of the fish. You are small, perhaps 20 centimeters long, a species that will not be given a name for 66 million years, a deep-bodied fish with reflective scales that catch the dim, diffuse light and scatter it in directions that make you difficult to see from any particular angle. You've been living in tight formation with several thousand individuals of your own species for as long as you have existed. The formation is the context within which your entire experience of life has occurred. You have never fed alone. You have never moved without feeling the pressure and movement of other bodies nearby. The school is, in a fundamental sense, your world. You know it as a fish knows anything, through the constant sensory feedback of living in it. And now the world is loosening. The pressure on the outside of the school, the pressure that kept all those bodies pressed close together, is diminishing. The individuals near the edges begin to drift slightly further apart than they would have yesterday. You, in your position in the middle depths of the school, Feel this change as a slight decrease in the pressure information you receive through your lateral line, a slight increase in the space between yourself and the nearest individuals. The information is ambiguous, as most information is when you are a fish and the world is complex. Less pressure from outside could mean that the predator is far away, which is good news. It could also mean that the individuals at the edges have been taken by the predator, which is very bad news. The pattern matching system in your nervous system evaluates both possibilities and chooses the more likely one. The pattern of dispersal feels different from the pattern of attack. Attack produces a specific ripple, a directional collapse of the school in the direction opposite the threat, a sudden compression from one side that propagates through the school like a wave. What you're feeling now is omnidirectional, uniform. The edges are spreading out, not disappearing, and they are spreading in all directions simultaneously, not in the directed collapse that attack produces. Your nervous system reaches its conclusion. This is relaxation, not danger. The spaces around you widen fractionally, and your response is to widen with them. The fish in the Cretaceous Sea, in the weeks after the Mosasaurus's death, are a study in the ecology of uncertainty. They are operating in a world that has changed in ways they cannot detect directly, responding to the changed world through the altered signals they receive from it, adjusting their behavior in the direction that the signals indicate without any ability to understand the larger context that is producing those signals. They are responding correctly to the information they have. The information they have is incomplete, limited to what their senses can detect in the water immediately around them, but they make the best use of what they have, and their best use of it is, in many cases, sufficient to allow them to survive. The world the fish is navigating is a diminished world. This is the counterweight to the narrative of freedom that might accompany the absence of the apex predator. The fish did not escape from the Mosasaurus into a world of greater abundance and opportunity. The fish escaped from the Mosasaurus into a world that is, in almost every measurable way, worse. The productivity of the phytoplankton has crashed. The zooplankton that feeds on the phytoplankton has crashed. The small fish that feed on the zooplankton are fewer and harder to find. The medium-sized prey that a 20-centimetre fish might itself pursue is harder to find. The food web has been damaged at its base, and the damage propagates upward through every level. The cold is a constant pressure. Fish are ectothermic, their body temperature determined by the surrounding water. In cold water, their metabolic processes slow, their digestion slows, their swimming speed slows, their response times slow. The individual fish that is 20 centimetres long and living in the gradually loosening school of the post-impact Cretaceous is not a fish in the full vigour of Cretaceous productivity. It is a fish running its metabolism at reduced speed, finding less food than it is accustomed to finding, burning fewer calories than usual, and needing to find fewer as a result, existing in the kind of careful minimum that characterises life under extreme environmental stress. What survives? The smallest, primarily. The fish with the lowest metabolic requirements, the fish that can run their bodies on the fewest calories, the fish that can slow down enough to endure a world that is colder and darker and less productive than the world they evolved in. Size is a liability now, where before it was often an asset. The larger fish, which required more food to sustain themselves, begin to disappear first. The smaller fish, the generalists, the opportunists, the ones whose mouths can accommodate whatever the impoverished ocean provides, from fish eggs to detritus to the tiny crustaceans that are themselves barely surviving on the diminished plankton. These are the ones that persist into the darker months and the colder months and the months that follow those. The sound of the ocean in the weeks after the Mosasaurus's stillness is the sound of reduction. It is the sound of fewer animals moving less vigorously, making less noise, producing less turbulence. It is quieter than it was in the productive abundance of the full late Cretaceous, when the seaway was rich with fish and ammonites and sea turtles and plesiosaurs, and the Mosasaurus moving among them all like a law of physics. That ocean was loud with life. This ocean is quieter. Not the silence of something ended, but the silence of something diminished, the hush of a world catching its breath between one era and another. And through that quieter water, you drift. In whatever space your own body occupies right now, in whatever arrangement of warmth and dark and soft surface it rests against, you are doing what the fish are doing, what the ammonites are doing, what every organism in the post-impact Cretaceous sea is doing, adjusting, finding the position that the changed world makes available, making the best use of what is there. The fish do not grieve for the productivity of the late Cretaceous. They only know what is in front of them, and they respond to it, and they continue. There is something in that simple fact that belongs to this particular hour, when the day is behind you, and the night has taken on its quieter character, and what is in front of you is simply rest. Respond to it. Continue. If you're still with us, still here in the deep water, still drifting in the quiet dark of the Cretaceous sea, then let this moment hold you. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The plesiosaurs are a different kind of ancient from the Mosasaurus. Where the Mosasaurus is the product of a relatively recent return to the sea, a lineage of perhaps 30 to 40 million years of marine adaptation built on a fundamentally terrestrial ancestry, the plesiosaurs have been in the water since the Triassic period, 200 million years before the night we are imagining. They are the product of a longer, and in some ways more complete commitment to the ocean, having spent so many millions of years in the water that their body plan had diverged substantially from any terrestrial ancestor, producing something that no longer resembles its land-dwelling origins in any obvious way. The elasmosaurids are the most visually striking of the plesiosaur lineages. Their necks are so long, accounting for more than half of the total body length of the animal, that the first person to describe a complete skeleton assumed it had been assembled incorrectly and that the neck must be the tail. When the orientation was confirmed, the naturalist who described it reportedly said something to the effect that nature had simply gone too far with this particular design, and he was not entirely wrong. The neck of Elasmosaurus platurus contains 72 cervical vertebrae. The human neck contains 7. The giraffe's neck, often cited as the extreme example of cervical elongation among living animals, contains the same 7 cervical vertebrae as every other mammal, just larger. The elasmosaurid's neck is not an elongation of the standard vertebral count. It is an actual proliferation of the vertebrae themselves, 72 separate bones where 7 would have served in the animal's distant ancestors. This neck is not flexible in the way that a swan's neck is flexible. A swan's neck, which appears similarly elongated and sinuous, can curl into tight curves because the vertebrae are small and numerous, and the muscles and ligaments between them allow significant angular displacement at each joint. The elasmosaurid's neck, despite its length, is more constrained. Each individual joint allows only a small angle of movement, and the neck is relatively stiff in the lateral plane, designed more for elevation and depression than for the horizontal swooping that movies tend to imagine. The neck curves in a gentle S shape in its natural resting position, the head carried at the level of or slightly below the water surface when the animal is at the surface, the neck arching back toward the body in a smooth, passive curve. What the neck is for, functionally, is distance. The elasmosaurid can hold the bulk of its body still, reducing its own acoustic and pressure signature, while extending the neck to close the last few meters to a prey item. The prey sees the neck moving toward it but cannot always perceive the body behind the neck as a threat, because the body is so far away and so much quieter. The strategy depends on the prey's limited ability to identify threats at a distance. If you cannot perceive the whole animal, you cannot accurately assess the danger. The elasmosaurid strategy exploits this limitation, reducing the apparent threat size by concealing the body while the neck closes the distance. In the Western Interior Seaway, the elasmosaurids occupy a very different niche from the Mosasaurus. Where the Mosasaurus hunts by speed and power, pursuing prey through open water, the elasmosaurid hunts by stealth and patience, positioning itself below a shoal of small fish and then extending the neck upward at an angle to strike from below. Where the Mosasaurus takes large individual prey items, the elasmosaurid takes small prey, one at a time, repeatedly, building a meal through accumulation rather than a single decisive strike. The two animals are not in competition in any direct sense. They are working different parts of the same food web with different tools. On the night after the Mosasaurus's stillness, the elasmosaurid floats in the Western Interior Seaway at a depth of perhaps 15 meters. Its flippers, 4 of them, roughly equal in size, maintain its position in the water column with minimal movement. The natural buoyancy of its tissues, combined with the density of the gastroliths, the stomach stones it swallows to aid buoyancy control, has been calibrated through experience to hold it at roughly this depth without continuous active swimming. The neck trails loosely in the current, the head turned slightly to one side, the small, peg-like teeth partially visible through the slightly open jaws. The elasmosaurid is cold. The water is colder than it has ever been in this animal's experience, and the animal is cold-blooded in a more complete sense than the Mosasaurus. Its metabolism is running at a fraction of its summer rate. Its movements are slow. Its hunting efficiency has declined sharply. But the elasmosaurid has resources that the Mosasaurus did not have. It can go for very long periods without food, its slow metabolism demanding less energy than the Mosasaurus's more elevated metabolic rate. It can survive on smaller prey items, the tiny fish and invertebrates that are still available in the impoverished water column, where the Mosasaurus needed large prey that was becoming increasingly scarce. The elasmosaurid's smaller requirements make it paradoxically better suited to the changed world than the apex predator that had dominated the seaway. But better suited is relative. The elasmosaurid is not well suited to the post-impact world in any absolute sense. It is merely less poorly suited than some of the alternatives. The darkness has reduced the productivity of the phytoplankton, which has reduced the zooplankton, which has reduced the small fish that are the elasmosaurid's primary prey. The food web is thinning from the bottom up, and while the elasmosaurid's requirements are modest by the standards of Cretaceous marine life, they are not zero. The animal must eat eventually, and the water is offering less and less of what it needs. The relationship between the plesiosaurs and the Mosasaurus in the Cretaceous Sea has always been a complex one. They were not predator and prey in any systematic sense, though mosasaurs did occasionally prey on juvenile plesiosaurs, as the fossil evidence suggests. They were not competitors in any direct way, occupying different enough ecological niches that they rarely came into direct conflict over the same resource. They shared the ocean the way different guilds of workers share a workshop, each using different tools for different purposes, rarely in each other's way but always aware of each other's presence. What the plesiosaur feels in the hours after the Mosasaurus's death, if feel is the right word for what a plesiosaur experiences, is not recognizable as grief or relief or anything that we could map onto human emotional categories. What it experiences is a change in the chemical environment of the water, a change that its chemoreceptors register as the fading of a familiar signal. The Mosasaurus's chemical signature, which the plesiosaur has been detecting as background noise for its entire life, is diminishing. This is information. The plesiosaur's nervous system receives the information, processes it, and produces a response. The response is, no immediate action required. Continue resting. The plesiosaur continues resting. This is appropriate. The conservation of energy is the most urgent task for any animal in the post-impact Cretaceous, and rest is the most efficient form of energy conservation. The plesiosaur has not learned this as a response to the current crisis. It has simply always been what plesiosaurs do when the temperature drops and the food is sparse. Slow down, conserve, wait for things to improve. This behavioral strategy, which served the plesiosaurs well through previous periods of ecological stress, is being deployed now against a crisis that exceeds anything the plesiosaur lineage has previously encountered. The gastroliths in the plesiosaur's stomach make a faint sound as the animal moves, a grinding, settling noise that the water carries in a short radius around the animal. Researchers have debated the function of plesiosaur gastroliths at length. The current consensus favours buoyancy control, ballast that the animal can use to adjust its position in the water column. But there are those who suggest additional functions, mechanical digestion of prey, the way birds use gizzard stones, or even a role in the animal's acoustic environment. The stomach stones producing sounds that might serve communicative purposes. In the dark, cold water of the post-impact seaway, the sound of settling gastroliths is one of the few organic sounds that persists in the diminished acoustic environment. How long will the plesiosaur survive? Longer than the Mosasaurus, probably. Its lower metabolic requirements allow it to extend its survival on diminished resources, but not indefinitely, not long enough. The food web has been too severely damaged for any large marine animal to persist through the darkness on what remains. The plesiosaurs of the world's oceans will be gone within months, or at most a few years, of the impact that ended the Cretaceous. Some populations may have held on longer than others, in regions where local conditions were slightly better, where the darkness was fractionally less complete, where the food web retained slightly more of its former productivity. But the end was the same everywhere. The plesiosaurs, like the mosasaurs, went still. What does it mean that both of these extraordinary lineages ended at the same geological moment? It means that the cause of their extinction was not any failure of their own design, not any inherent vulnerability in the reptilian body plan or the marine lifestyle. It means that the cause was external, cosmic, a force that had nothing to do with the fitness or unfitness of the animals it destroyed. The Mosasaurus was perfectly adapted to its world. The plesiosaur was perfectly adapted to its world. The asteroid was not interested in adaptation. It was interested in nothing. It was a rock moving through space at speed, arriving at a specific location on a specific day, and the biological consequences of its arrival were as indifferent to the quality of the organisms it affected as the weather is indifferent to the quality of the buildings it damages. This is a thought worth carrying with you into the quiet part of the night, the part where the thinking slows and the images become less sequential. Not every ending is a judgment, not every loss is a consequence of a flaw. Sometimes things end because something larger than them, something that operates at a different scale entirely, has moved through the same space at the same time and changed the conditions that made them possible. The Mosasaurus and the plesiosaur were magnificent. They were also in the wrong place when the physics of the solar system delivered an asteroid to the Yucatan Peninsula. These two facts are not in contradiction. They exist simultaneously, and the coexistence of the magnificence and the accident is part of what makes the story as large as the sea that held it. The plesiosaur floats in the cold dark, its neck trails in the current, its flippers make small, slow adjustments, its gastroliths settle with a sound that the water carries a short distance and then absorbs, and below it, somewhere on the floor of the seaway, the Mosasaurus continues its slow return to the chemistry of the water. The two great animals, one alive and one no longer, are separated by 60 meters of dark water and the narrow margin between what persists and what has ended. Tonight they share the ocean. After this they will share only the stone. The ammonites had been in the ocean for 330 million years before the night the Mosasaurus went still. This is a number that resists comprehension, so let us approach it from a different direction. The ammonites were already ancient when the first dinosaur walked. They were already ancient when the first forests grew on the land. They had already been in the ocean for 130 million years when the first fish climbed out of the water on ancestral limbs. The ammonites are not a new innovation of the Cretaceous. They are the oldest thing in this story. They are the context within which everything else, including the Mosasaurus, occurred. Think for a moment about what 330 million years means in terms of survival. The ammonites first appeared in the Devonian period, when the oceans were still warm and shallow and strange, with creatures we have no modern analogues for. They diversified through the Carboniferous, when giant insects flew through oxygen-rich forests and amphibians claimed the riverbanks. They persisted through the Permian extinction, the Great Dying, when 96% of all marine species were wiped from the oceans in one of the most total biological collapses the Earth has ever experienced. They came through that event diminished, but alive. They rebuilt. They diversified again, and again, and again. 4 mass extinctions, and the ammonites survived every one. The secret of their success was the shell, the logarithmic spiral, a form that appears throughout nature wherever the efficient accumulation of material and space is required. In the chambers of a nautilus, in the form of certain galaxies, in the growth pattern of a sunflower's seeds, in the curl of a breaking wave. The logarithmic spiral is what you get when you build something that must maintain the same proportions as it grows, adding to its outer edge at a constant rate while preserving the shape of the whole. The ammonite shell is this principle realized in calcium carbonate, the same mineral that would eventually become much of the white chalk covering the floors of the late Cretaceous sea. Inside the shell, the ammonite's body occupies only the outermost chamber, the largest one, the one at the opening of the spiral. The chambers behind it, the ones it has grown past as it has expanded its shell outward and added new material at the lip, are not empty. They are connected to the ammonite's body by a thin strand of tissue called the sipuncle, which runs through a small hole in the wall of each successive chamber. The ammonite uses this connection to regulate the gas content of the earlier chambers, pumping nitrogen in or out to adjust its buoyancy in the water column. The shell is in effect a biological submarine, a vessel of controlled descent and ascent, whose depth can be modulated by adjusting the gas content of its sealed inner compartments. This buoyancy control is elegant and efficient. It requires very little energy expenditure compared to the active swimming that fish must perform to maintain their position in the water column. The ammonite can hover at a chosen depth with minimal effort, its shell doing the work of maintaining position, while its body is free to direct attention outward, toward food and toward threats. In a normal, productive Cretaceous ocean, this efficiency is a tremendous advantage. The ammonite can outlast prey items that tire, can maintain position in productive zones without burning significant energy, can wait for opportunities with a patience that active swimmers cannot afford. But here is what is easy to miss drifting in the dark water above the Mosasaurus's stillness. The ammonite is more than a shell. It is a mind of sorts, diffuse and chemical, but a mind. It processes information, it makes decisions, it adjusts. Its tentacles, extending from the opening of the shell, are sensitive to pressure and chemistry, to the faint trails of scent that prey leaves behind in the water column. The ammonite follows these trails with something that might be called patience, though it is more accurate to call it the absence of impatience, a quality that 330 million years of survival tends to produce. The ammonites that move through the Western Interior Seaway on the night of the Mosasaurus's stillness are moving through water that is already beginning to change. The temperature is dropping. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that the siphuncle, that delicate strand of regulating tissue, is working harder than usual to maintain the calibrated gas balance in the shell's inner chambers. The system is designed for a specific range of conditions. It has been refined for that range over hundreds of millions of years, and the water is moving outside that range. When the water temperature drops rapidly, as it is doing in the weeks following the asteroid impact, the ammonite's buoyancy system struggles to adapt quickly enough. The gas-to-liquid ratio in the chambers that was optimal for the warm late Cretaceous is no longer optimal for the colder water. Some ammonites begin to sink, unable to maintain the position in the water column they have occupied all their lives. Others float too high, their shells now providing more buoyancy than desired in the changed conditions. The precision instrument of the shell, which has served the ammonites for 330 million years, is suddenly being asked to operate in conditions it was not designed for. The ammonites that sink to the seafloor do not die immediately. Ammonites can survive at depth within limits. Some species are deep water specialists, adapted to the cold and pressure of the lower water column. But the animals that were surface and midwater feeders, whose prey is the small crustaceans and fish of the productive upper ocean, cannot feed efficiently at depth. They descend into cold and darkness and food scarcity simultaneously. The 330 million year history of ammonite adaptation has produced solutions for many problems. It has not, it seems, produced a sufficient solution for this particular combination of cold and dark and scarcity occurring simultaneously and without warning. And yet, and this is what deserves your attention as you settle deeper into the quiet of this story, the young ones try. Juvenile ammonites, smaller, with shells still pale and thin, hover in the water column longer than their parents. They are lighter, they have less mass to support. The buoyancy system is slightly more responsive in a smaller shell. Some of them drift upward rather than down, carried toward the surface by the confused gas balance, rising into water that is even colder, even more stripped of prey. But they are still moving. They are still doing what ammonites have always done, adjusting, persisting, trying the next depth, following the next chemical signal. They do not know what has changed. They only know the water and what the water is telling them, and they respond as their kind has always responded. The ammonites nearest the surface when the Mosasaurus went still are the ones that can most clearly be imagined in the mind's eye. They are the ones that caught what little light remained in the particulate-filtered night, their shells faintly iridescent in the dim glow of bioluminescent plankton drifting below them. The shells turn slowly in whatever weak current still moves through the changed water. The tentacles extend, retract, extend again, testing the water for signals that are coming back strange, attenuated, wrong in ways the ammonite cannot process or name. Just wrong. The chemical signature of the ocean itself has shifted, and the ammonite, which has read the ocean's chemistry for its entire 330 million year lineage, is reading something new. There is something in the image of the ammonite, that ancient spiral drifting in the cold dark of the post-impact Cretaceous, that carries a particular weight. The ammonite is 330 million years old as a lineage. It has survived 4 previous mass extinction events. It arrived at the late Cretaceous as a triumphant success story, the dominant cephalopod of the Mesozoic Sea, present in thousands of species filling every depth zone and feeding niche the ocean offered. And now it is here, in this cold dark, adjusting its buoyancy fractions of a millimetre at a time, doing what it has always done, persisting, and finding at last a combination of circumstances that its long history of persistence cannot overcome. What does it mean that the ammonites did not survive? They went with the Mosasaurus and the plesiosaurs and the non-avian dinosaurs at the Cretaceous boundary, leaving no descendants, leaving behind only an extraordinary fossil record, tens of thousands of species preserved in stone across the world, a record so complete and so varied that paleontologists use ammonite species as index fossils, as time markers, using the presence of specific ammonite species in a rock layer to determine the age of that layer with considerable precision. The ammonites, in death, became clocks. They became the way we measure the depth of geological time itself. Is there a kind of immortality in that? The spiral that served a living animal for 330 million years, now serving science as a timestamp, a fixed point in the long sequence of change. The last ammonite, whichever individual it was, wherever in the world's oceans it drifted on whatever night it drew its last breath through its mantle cavity, did not know it was the last. It knew only what every ammonite had always known: the temperature of the water, the pressure of the depth, the chemical information coming in through its chemoreceptors, the buoyancy state of its chambers, the presence or absence of prey items in the column of water immediately around it. It processed this information and produced a response, and then, at some point, the information stopped coming in, or the processing stopped, or the response capacity failed. And the last ammonite went still. The shell sank. The body, which had no hard parts beyond the shell, decomposed quickly in the changed water. The shell itself, that 330 million year old design, that logarithmic perfection, that buoyancy instrument of extraordinary precision, settled into the sediment. Over time, as sediment accumulated above it, the shell filled with minerals, the original calcium carbonate either preserved or replaced by something more stable. The spiral form survived, even as everything else about the last ammonite was lost. Form persisting after function, shape remaining after the life that had that shape was gone. You can hold this thought gently, the way you would hold something fragile found in the mud of a riverbank. The form remains. The spiral is still in the stone, waiting to be found 66 million years from now by a hammer and a careful eye. The silence of the Cretaceous ocean carries somehow the echo of all those spirals, all those 330 million years of quiet, patient, buoyancy-adjusted existence. The last spiral was not the end of the form, only the end of the life that the form was made for. Breathe here, in the way of the ammonite, which breathed through its mantle cavity in slow, regular pulses, exchanging gas with the water around it. Not urgently, not with effort. The way that breathing becomes, when you are this close to sleep, almost automatic, almost something that happens to you rather than something you do. Let it happen. Let the breathing be what it is. The ammonite managed it for 330 million years. You only need to manage it for the rest of this night. The spiral turns slowly in the sediment. The water above it goes quiet. And the quiet, like everything else in this story, is not an ending. It is a kind of patience. There is a story that mass extinctions tell if you know how to listen. It is not a story about destruction, though destruction is certainly part of it. It is a story about the particular qualities that allow life to persist through conditions that life was not designed for. It is a story about what the world selects for when the normal rules of selection are suspended, when the usual advantages become liabilities, when the usual vulnerabilities become advantages. It is, in other words, a story about smallness, about generalism, about the value of not being too committed to any particular way of being alive. Consider what it means to be committed. The Mosasaurus was committed, deeply, irreversibly committed to a specific way of being alive. Its entire body was an argument for a particular set of conditions: warm water, abundant prey, the specific sensory environment of the late Cretaceous ocean. Remove those conditions and the Mosasaurus has nothing to fall back on. It cannot retreat into a smaller form. It cannot change its thermal requirements overnight. It cannot suddenly shift its diet to something that is not a large marine animal, when large marine animals become scarce. The Mosasaurus was perfectly adapted to its world, and perfect adaptation is not the same as flexible adaptation. The two things look identical when conditions are stable. They diverge catastrophically when conditions are not. The animals that survived the end of the Cretaceous were, almost universally, animals that had never been perfectly adapted. They were the generalists, the opportunists, the animals that had survived not because they were the best at any particular thing, but because they were adequate at many things. The small mammals that had been living in the margins of the dinosaur world for 100 million years were adequate in this sense. They could eat insects, seeds, roots, small vertebrates, carrion, almost anything that had nutritional value. They could regulate their own body temperature internally, which meant the cold was a metabolic challenge rather than a lethal constraint. They could fit into burrows and crevices and spaces that large animals could not access, where the temperature was relatively stable even as the surface world swung between extremes. 100 million years in the margins. That is the inheritance of every mammal alive today, including you. For 100 million years, the ancestors of every human being lived small and secretive and largely nocturnal in a world that belonged to something else. They foraged in the leaf litter. They sheltered in root cavities. They watched the great dinosaurs move through the forest above them, and they developed, under that pressure, exactly the qualities that would allow them to survive when the great dinosaurs were gone. The darkness that terrified us once, that made us small and quick and quiet, that darkness was the school, and what it taught was persistence. The crocodilians survived too. This is initially surprising because crocodilians are largish and cold-blooded and dependent on warm temperatures for activity. But crocodilians have a specific set of survival skills that proved adequate for the post-impact world. They can slow their metabolism to almost nothing when conditions are bad, entering a state of dormancy that allows them to survive months without food. Their diet is enormously flexible, encompassing fish, mammals, birds, carrion, invertebrates, and essentially anything organic that comes within reach, and they can survive in freshwater environments, away from the poisoned and acidifying ocean, in rivers and lakes drawing their water from rain rather than from the acid-loaded marine environment. The crocodilians that float today in African rivers and Australian billabongs are almost unchanged from the ones that watched the end of the Cretaceous from their muddy riverbanks. They found a design that worked and they kept it. The birds survived, the small ones, the non-specialized seed-eaters and insectivores and omnivores that had been living in the undergrowth of Cretaceous forests. The large flightless forms and the highly specialized fish hunters were mostly lost, but the birds that could eat almost anything, that could live in almost any environment, that could reproduce quickly and in small clutches requiring minimal parental investment, these birds made it through. And they are the ancestors of every bird that will ever exist, the 13,000 or so species that will eventually fill the Cenozoic skies. Every morning you have ever heard bird song through an open window, every time a sparrow has moved through the leaf shadow of a summer tree, you have been hearing and seeing the descendants of those survivors. The ordinary birds, the small and adaptable ones, they carried the future in their small hollow bones. In the ocean, the survivors are the small and the adaptable, sharks, some of them. The smaller, more generalist species that can shift their diet when preferred, prey disappears. Teleost fish, the bony fish group that will eventually come to dominate the modern ocean, survive in numbers sufficient to rebuild. Sea turtles, which can slow their metabolism dramatically, which are already adapted to both marine and terrestrial environments, which can eat jellyfish and seagrasses and almost anything else the depleted ocean provides. Some squid and octopus relatives, which breed quickly and can shift their diet fluidly, survive the darkness and cold with more success than their slower reproducing cousins. These are not the dominant animals of the Cretaceous ocean. They were the background figures, the supporting cast, the animals that lived in the spaces the Mosasaurus did not occupy. And now the Mosasaurus's space is empty, and it is enormous, and they will have millions of years to grow into it. And in the water column, invisible to any large-bodied animal but present in extraordinary numbers, the plankton that forms the base of the ocean's food web. The photosynthetic phytoplankton takes the worst hit. because the darkness that follows the impact is most damaging to organisms that depend on light. But deep in the sediment, the resting cysts of phytoplankton species wait out the darkness. These cysts, tiny packets of dormant life sealed against the environment, can survive years without light or warmth. They are the seeds of the ocean's recovery. When the sky eventually clears, when enough time passes for the aerosols to settle and the sunlight to return, these cysts will germinate, and the phytoplankton will bloom again, and the chain of energy from sunlight to the largest organisms will begin to rebuild from its foundation. The rebuilding will take millions of years, not thousands, not decades, millions. The full recovery of marine biodiversity to Cretaceous levels in terms of the number of species and the complexity of ecological relationships will not happen on any timescale that human civilization can encompass. What emerges from the rebuilding will not be a restoration of what was lost. It will be something new, built by different lineages finding their way into the ecological space that the mass extinction created. The whales will eventually occupy the large marine predator niche, but not for 50 million years, and the whales will do it differently, because whales are mammals, and mammals have their own inheritance, their own history of smallness and patience that they carry into the ocean with them. The Cretaceous ocean will not be rebuilt, it will be replaced. What it was, the specific arrangement of species and relationships and ecological roles that made it what it was, is gone with the Mosasaurus and the Plesiosaurs and the Ammonites and the dozens of other lineages that did not make it through the filter of the end Cretaceous event. The Western Interior Seaway itself will drain, eventually, as the tectonic forces that created it shift and the North American continent reasserts its connection across the interior. The seaway will become rock. The rock will become sedimentary layers. The layers will become the floor of the Great Plains, the long flat horizon of the American interior, where the wind moves through grass now instead of through water. Kansas is what becomes of the Western Interior Seaway. The sky above it carries weather instead of surface currents. It is the same space, transformed past recognition. What remains is not the ocean itself. What remains is the record. The chalk beds of England, which are the compressed remains of billions of coccolithophore shells that fell to the bottom of the late Cretaceous sea over millions of years, preserve the chemical signature of the ocean that was. The ammonite fossils preserve the form of the animals that swam in it. The mosasaur specimens in museums around the world preserve the bones of the apex predator that organized it. The iridium layer in the rock preserves the moment of the impact, the thin dark line that says, "Here is where one world ended and another began." These are the translations of the Cretaceous ocean into a form that the future can read. The record is the memory of the thing itself. And what the future reads, in these bones and shells and chemical signatures, is not a tragedy. It is a story. A long, specific, profligate, beautiful story about what happens when life has access to a warm, shallow, rich ocean for 80 million years without interruption. About the forms it takes when the conditions are favourable and the time is sufficient. About the relationships it builds, the ecological architectures it constructs, the extraordinary Baroque elaboration of form and function it achieves when given enough space and enough time. The story ends as all stories do. The Mosasaurus goes still, the ammonites descend and do not resurface. The plesiosaurs float in the cold dark and then they too go still. But the story having ended does not mean the story is erased. The record holds it. The chalk holds it. The iridium holds it. You, reading the story now, hold it. The small and the patient survived. This is the lesson the KPG extinction delivers, and it is not a small lesson. It is not a lesson about failure or about loss, though failure and loss are woven through it. It is a lesson about the deep reliability of the patient form, the adaptable form, the form that does not commit entirely to any single set of conditions. The mammals in their burrows, the crocodilians in their rivers, the birds in the leaf shadow. They did not survive because they were better. They survived because they were different in exactly the ways that difference mattered. They had been shaped by 100 million years of being secondary, and being secondary had made them, without their knowing it, into the form that would inherit the world. You are still here. The room around you, in the darkness of its own kind of night, is quiet. The concerns of the day have retreated to wherever concerns go when sleep approaches, which is not very far, but far enough. Here in the water, in the dark column of the ancient sea, you and the story are the same temperature now, the same depth, the same pace. The small and the patient survive. You have been small tonight, in the good sense. Quiet and contained and unhurried. You have been patient, and the Cretaceous ocean, in whatever way an ancient thing acknowledges the present, holds you in its long memory and lets you rest. The water remembers everything. This is not a poetic exaggeration, but a chemical fact. The ocean is the planet's primary repository of dissolved materials, the receiver of everything that rain washes off the land, everything that rivers carry down from mountains, everything that submarine volcanoes exhale from the planet's interior, everything that organisms add to it through their metabolic processes and remove from it through their bodies. The ocean has been keeping this record for 4 billion years, adjusting its chemistry in response to every biological and geological event of significance, carrying the signature of those events forward in time in the isotopic ratios of its dissolved compounds, in the trace element concentrations of its sediments, in the crystal structure of the shells and bones and teeth that fall to its floor and are buried there. The Cretaceous ocean, at the moment of the asteroid impact, has a specific chemical composition. It is warmer than modern oceans, which means it holds less dissolved oxygen but more dissolved calcium carbonate. The pH is slightly different from the modern ocean, buffered by the high concentration of carbonate that the warm water can maintain. The ratio of specific isotopes of oxygen dissolved in the water tells a story about temperature, because the proportion of heavier versus lighter oxygen isotopes in water changes with temperature in a predictable way. The ocean knows its own temperature in this chemical sense, and the temperature is recorded in every shell that forms in it, every tooth, every bone that settles to the seafloor and becomes part of the rock that the future will eventually find and read. When the asteroid hits and the world begins to change, the ocean's chemistry changes with it. The immediate effects are dramatic. The sulfur compounds released by the impact's interaction with the gypsum deposits at Chicxulub are converted in the atmosphere to sulfuric acid aerosols, which fall as acid rain across the entire planet. This acid rain, when it reaches the ocean, reacts with the dissolved calcium carbonate, reducing the buffering capacity of the water and beginning a process of acidification. The pH of the ocean surface drops. Not precipitously at first, not catastrophically, but measurably, significantly, in a way that stresses the organisms whose biology depends on maintaining the stable, slightly alkaline chemistry of the normal Cretaceous sea. The organisms most immediately affected are the calcifiers, the animals and plants that build their bodies from calcium carbonate, the ammonites, obviously, but also the coccolithophores, those microscopic photosynthetic plankton whose tiny calcium carbonate plates, called coccoliths, are so abundant in the late Cretaceous that they are literally building the chalk beds of southern England, plate by plate, falling to the seafloor in their trillions every day. In an acidifying ocean, these plates begin to dissolve before they reach the floor. The chalk building process slows, falters, stops. The base of the food web, already stressed by the darkness that is preventing photosynthesis, is hit again by the chemical change in the medium in which it lives, one crisis compounding another, in a system that had no capacity to absorb either alone. The coral reef ecosystems, those extraordinary architectures built on the calcium carbonate skeletons of tiny polyps over thousands of years, are among the most immediate casualties of the ocean's chemical shift. The late Cretaceous reefs, built in large part by rudest bivalves rather than the stony corals that will dominate the modern ocean, cannot maintain their structure against the dissolution the acidifying water imposes on their frameworks. The great reef provinces that had lined the shallow margins of the Tethys Sea and the edges of the Western Interior Seaway begin to erode not from external force but from within, the chemistry of the water working slowly and continuously against the chemistry of the calcium carbonate that holds the reef together. These chemical changes are invisible to the eye. You cannot see acid rain from inside the ocean. You cannot see the change in pH in the colour of the water or the quality of the light. What you can see, if you are small enough and close enough to the right organisms, is the slow dissolution of shells. A shell that would normally be hard and intact begins to show signs of etching, of pitting, of the surface being eaten away by a chemistry that is slightly wrong for the materials from which the shell is made. The change is slow, but it is continuous. And in the way of slow, continuous changes, in the way of all the deep and patient forces that have shaped this ocean over its long history, it is inexorable. The water also changes its temperature, but more slowly than its chemistry. The ocean has enormous thermal inertia, enormous resistance to rapid temperature change, because of the high specific heat capacity of water. Water can absorb a great deal of thermal energy without changing its temperature much, which is why the ocean moderates the climate of coastal regions, and why ocean temperature changes happen more slowly than atmospheric temperature changes. The atmosphere above the Cretaceous sea begins to cool relatively quickly after the initial impact-generated heat pulse passes. The ocean follows, but with a lag measured in years rather than months. The water holds the warmth longer than the air does. It is the last thing to let go. This thermal lag is both a protection and a problem for the ocean's inhabitants. The protection is that the ocean's temperature does not immediately plunge to match the cold atmosphere above it, giving marine organisms more time to adapt than the atmosphere gives to land organisms. The problem is that when the ocean does cool, it cools slowly and persistently, and the organisms adapted to the specific thermal regime of the late Cretaceous have no way to avoid the change. They cannot move to a warmer part of the ocean, because the change is global. They cannot burrow to a deeper, warmer layer, because the deeper layers are actually colder than the surface. There is no direction to go. There is only the slow, continuous cooling, and the biology trying to keep pace with it. The Mosasaurus, which had some capacity for thermoregulation, was buffered from the worst of the immediate temperature effects. But as the ocean continued to cool in the weeks and months after the impact, the buffering capacity of its elevated metabolism began to be exceeded. The warm water hunting grounds it had always used became less efficient, the prey less active in the colder water, the Mosasaurus itself slightly slower, slightly less precise. The thermal clines it had navigated, diving into cold water for short periods and returning to warm surface water to restore its temperature, became more extreme as the surface water cooled and the gradient between surface and depth compressed and eventually reversed. The diving that had been a foraging strategy became a thermoregulatory risk. The water remembered the Mosasaurus in chemical ways long after the Mosasaurus was gone. The chemical compounds that its metabolism had produced, the waste products excreted into the water, the chemical signatures of its presence that had been a constant feature of the Western Interior Seaway's chemical environment for millions of years, these began to fade as the last individuals died, and the ecosystem that had produced those compounds ceased to maintain them. The chemistry of the ocean shifted fractionally in the specific ways corresponding to the absence of a large, active, metabolically elevated predator. The water noticed, in the only way water can notice anything, by becoming chemically different. And the water recorded it, the sediment laying down its slow annual layers on the floor of the Western Interior Seaway in the last years of the Cretaceous records the extinction event in several ways that geologists have learned to read. There is a sudden change in the proportion of certain isotopes. There is the iridium layer, that thin dark line distributed globally by the impact's ejected material, settling onto the surfaces of every ocean and continent in a precise and measurable signature. There is a change in the fossils. Below the iridium layer, mosasaurs and ammonites and plesiosaurs in abundance. Above the iridium layer, none of these things. The sediment holds the testimony of the transition in absolute silence, waiting for whoever has the tools to read it. The KPG boundary, the line between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, is one of the sharpest, most clearly defined transitions in the entire fossil record. It is, in geological terms, effectively instantaneous, occurring in less than 100,000 years, which is a moment in the 4 billion year history of the ocean. Below the line, one world. Above the line, a completely different world. The water does not know this boundary exists. It only knows that one day, on a timescale of millions of years, the chemistry on one side of that line is different from the chemistry on the other. The water does not have a word for what happened. It only has the record, and the record is more precise than any word. The sulfate aerosols that the impact ejected into the stratosphere had a half-life of years rather than months, because the stratosphere has no rain to wash aerosols out. They stayed suspended in the cold upper atmosphere, reflecting sunlight back into space, maintaining the dimness and the cold. The ocean felt this persistence in its own way, in the continued suppression of photosynthesis in the surface water, in the continued fall of sea surface temperatures, in the continued acidification from the sulfur compounds slowly cycling back into the ocean through precipitation. The impact was a single moment. Its effects were not. They unfolded over years and decades, and the ocean recorded every phase of them in its chemistry and its sediment and its gradual reluctant change. The water remembered. The water always remembers, and what it remembered, in the chemistry of the sediment that covered the Mosasaurus's resting place, and covered the last ammonite shell, and covered the last plesiosaur bone, was the shape of a world that had existed for a very long time, and then, in a moment that the water felt but did not name, was no longer what it had been, not erased, not forgotten, remembered in the chemical language of dissolved ions and isotope ratios, and the slow accumulation of particles on a dark and quiet floor. Let the water's memory be your memory for this moment. Let the long record of what was held in the chemistry of ancient seas be a kind of comfort, the understanding that nothing is truly lost, that the forms persist in the stone even when the life is gone, that the record continues even when the living contributors to the record have ceased. The Mosasaurus is in the stone, the ammonites are in the stone, the chemistry of the Cretaceous sea is in the chalk and the limestone and the sedimentary layers of a dozen continents. This story is in you now, woven into whatever this night is becoming in your own memory, which is also a kind of chemical record, your neurons holding the impression of what you have heard the way the sediment holds the impression of what fell through the water. Nothing is truly lost. The water remembers, and tonight, so do you. The darkness did not last forever. This is a fact worth sitting with, because in the immediate aftermath of the impact the darkness felt, if darkness can be said to feel anything, permanent. The aerosol layer in the stratosphere was dense enough and distributed enough to block the majority of incoming solar radiation for what current estimates suggest was between 1 and 2 years. A year or two of reduced or effectively absent sunlight is a geological instant. It is also a biological eternity. Everything that depends on light to live had to find another way or go still. In that eternity, the photosynthetic organisms that form the base of the food web experienced conditions essentially incompatible with active photosynthesis. The chlorophyll molecules that capture light energy and convert it to chemical energy do not work in the dark. They are, by design, instruments of light, precise molecular antennae tuned to specific wavelengths, built to convert photons into the electrochemical cascade that produces sugars. Without photons, the instrument has nothing to receive. Photosynthesis requires light the way, listening requires sound. Without them, the phytoplankton cannot produce the sugars that sustain their own metabolism, cannot reproduce, cannot maintain the living films and blooms that keep the marine food web supplied with the chemical energy it needs to function. But the resting cysts survived. These dormant stages, which various groups of phytoplankton can produce when conditions become hostile, are essentially closed systems, small packages of dormant life that can wait out adverse conditions for extended periods. They are not active. They are not growing or photosynthesizing. They are simply persisting, their metabolic processes slowed to the minimum required for maintenance of the cellular machinery, waiting for the signal that conditions have returned to the range in which active life is possible. They are patients made molecular. They are the biological equivalent of holding your breath, except they hold it not for seconds but for years. Some of these resting cysts are extraordinarily durable. Studies of sediment cores have found viable cysts that are thousands of years old. The dormancy strategy is ancient, predating the Cretaceous by hundreds of millions of years. It evolved in various forms in various lineages as a response to the unpredictability of the photic zone, the sunlit surface layer of the ocean where conditions can change rapidly with the seasons, with storm events, with shifts in ocean circulation. The ability to wait out the bad times is older than the Mosasaurus, older than the first ammonite. It is one of the deepest innovations in the history of ocean life, and on the far side of the KPG boundary, it proved to be among the most important. The signal was light. As the stratospheric aerosol layer gradually settled out over months and then years, as the sulfate particles clumped and grew heavy enough to fall, as the fine soot from the global wildfires was washed out of the atmosphere by rain, the sky above the post-impact ocean slowly, irregularly, with setbacks and recoveries began to lighten. Not to the full brightness of a Cretaceous afternoon, not immediately, but to enough for the first cautious molecules of chlorophyll in the first cautious resting cysts to detect the stimulus that meant activate, to enough for the first photosynthetic blooms in the recovering ocean to begin producing oxygen and sugars again, feeding the darkness-starved water with energy. Imagine what that first moment of activation might have looked like if you could see at the cellular scale. A cyst dormant in the surface layer of a cold post-impact ocean, detecting through its membrane the faint increase in photon flux, the same signal its ancestors have been responding to for hundreds of millions of years. The metabolic machinery, slowed almost to nothing, begins to turn again. Enzymes that have been waiting activate in sequence. The light capture systems unfold. Chlorophyll molecules reorient toward the new photon source. Sugars begin to accumulate. The cyst germinates. And where there was one dormant cell, there is now one living cell, and then two, and then four, beginning the exponential expansion that will given time produce a bloom. The first blooms of recovering phytoplankton in the post-impact ocean were not the diverse species-rich communities of the late Cretaceous. They were dominated by a few hardy, fast-growing species, generalists that could exploit the opening rapidly and build population density before more specialized competitors arrived. The ocean in the immediate aftermath of the mass extinction had, in a sense, cleared the competitive field. The usual species that would have prevented a fast-growing opportunist from dominating the productive surface waters were gone or greatly reduced. The opportunities were enormous, and the fastest reproducers took them. The first zooplankton to exploit the recovering phytoplankton was similarly opportunistic. The small, fast-reproducing copepods and ostracods, which had survived the dark months in various dormant or reduced activity states, responded to the recovering food supply with rapid population growth. Their generations are short, measured in weeks rather than years, which means they can respond to an improving food supply with a speed that larger, longer-lived organisms simply cannot match. Within a few generations, the copepods were present again in meaningful numbers in the recovering surface waters, grazing the new phytoplankton blooms, their tiny bodies tracing small arcs through water that had been empty of such motion for far too long. And behind the copepods, behind the zooplankton, the small fish. The survivors among the Cretaceous fish fauna began to feed and to reproduce, and the small, flexible, generalist fish that had survived the dark months were now producing their next generations into a world that, while nothing like the Cretaceous in productivity, was offering more food than it had been offering 6 months before. A world with more food than yesterday is, to an organism programmed for survival, an opportunity. Life recognizes opportunity the way water recognizes a low point. It flows toward it. The fish flowed toward the recovering food web. The ocean was becoming, slowly, noisier. Not the noise of the full Cretaceous sea, not the dense acoustic fabric of the Western Interior Seaway in its abundance, but something. The first tentative sounds of a recovering ecosystem, the movement of fish in their newly loosening schools, the chemical signals of phytoplankton in the water, the physical disturbance of zooplankton feeding, small bubbles of metabolic gas rising from the newly active surface layer, the faint click and chirp of the first invertebrate activity in the shallow zones. The ocean had been deeply quiet during the worst of the darkness, a quieter quiet than even the quiet of the Mosasauruses last night, which was at least the quiet of a world at full biological tension. The post-impact quiet was the quiet of an emptied space, a room from which the furniture has been removed. This new quiet of recovery was different from both. It was tentative, provisional. It was the sound of a world that was trying carefully to remember how to be alive. It started small and slow, in the places where the light returned first, in the shallower shelf waters where the aerosol layer was thinnest, and the recovering sunlight penetrated earliest. From those margins the recovery spread inward and downward, following the light as it returned, filling the space that the mass extinction had emptied with new activity, new chemistry, new sound. The Mosasaurus was not there to see any of this. The Mosasaurus had been gone for months by the time the first phytoplankton blooms of the recovery appeared in the Western Interior Seaway. The plesiosaurs were gone, the ammonites were gone, the specific acoustic and chemical and behavioral environment that they had created and inhabited and shaped for tens of millions of years was gone with them, leaving only the physical water, the dissolved minerals, the fundamental physics of the ocean which endure regardless of who is living in them. The stage remained. Only the performers had changed. What returned was not the Cretaceous ocean. What returned was the ocean, learning again how to be an ocean, with different organisms in different roles, making different sounds, creating different chemical environments, building new ecological architectures from different materials. The chalk that had been laid down for millions of years by Cretaceous coccolithophores continued to accumulate more slowly now, from different species, but accumulate it did. The sediment layers continued. The ocean did not stop being the ocean because the Cretaceous was over. The ocean has never stopped being the ocean. The first dolphins, those Eocene animals that would eventually become the dominant small cetaceans of the modern ocean, would not arrive for another 40 million years. The first great whales, those extraordinary Oligocene animals that would eventually occupy the ecological spaces left by the Mosasaurus and Plesiosaurs, would not arrive for another 30 million years. The ocean waited, in the patient way of oceans, filling the interim with whatever was available, building the scaffolding of a new marine world step by gradual step. The rebuilding was not a plan, it was a process. Life finds the openings and fills them. Light falls on the water and the cysts germinate. The food web reconstructs itself from the bottom up slowly, in the order that the physics and chemistry of the ocean allow. You are here in this patient dark, not the dark of the KPE boundary, not the dark of the aerosol-filtered years after the impact. Your dark is gentler and briefer, and entirely recoverable, a night's worth of darkness, the ordinary darkness that precedes every morning that has ever been. And the same principle that returned light to the recovering Cretaceous ocean is at work in your night. The darkness is not permanent, it has a duration, it has a far edge. The cysts in the sediment knew this, encoded in their biology, and they waited. You can do the same, with far less effort, in the warm and certain comfort of the life the long recovery of that ancient ocean eventually made possible. Let the light return in its own time, it always does. The ocean waited, and the light returned, and new life filled the space that the old life had vacated. Not the same life, better in some ways, diminished in others, simply different in most. But life, persistent, incorrigible, patient, returning to an ocean that had never stopped being ready to receive it. You are the consequence of that return. You are the result of every recovery, every survival, every patient cyst waiting in the dark for the photons to come back. The light came back then. It will come back again. Tonight, you do not need it. Tonight, the dark is the point. We have been in this silence for a long time now. The silence of the Cretaceous ocean after the Mosasaurus. The silence of the night around you, whichever night this is, wherever you are in it. These silences are not the same silence, but they have been keeping each other company in the dark, the ancient one and the present one, and somewhere in the space between them, there is something worth understanding. Not an urgent understanding, not a lesson you need to act on, just a quiet recognition, something to hold the way you might hold a smooth stone, feeling its weight without needing to do anything with it. The silence that the Mosasaurus left behind was not a simple absence. We have established this through the long hours of this story. The silence was a reorganization. The ocean did not become quieter in the Mosasaurus's absence. It became differently noisy, and then for a long geological moment it became truly quieter, the quiet of diminishment and cold and darkness, and then it began its long recovery into a different kind of sound entirely. The silence the Mosasaurus left behind was not a hole. It was a space that other things moved into, slowly, across millions of years, filling it with new forms and new relationships and new sounds that the Cretaceous had never heard. The silence was generative. The absence was an opening. There is something in this that applies to loss more broadly, to the kind of loss that is not about the death of an individual, but about the ending of an era, the passing of a way of things that will not return. The world that contained the Mosasaurus was a specific world, a world tuned to a specific temperature and light level and chemical composition that made the Mosasaurus possible, and that the Mosasaurus, in turn, helped to maintain. When that world ended, the Mosasaurus ended with it, because the Mosasaurus was not separable from its world. It was one of the things that made its world what it was. The Mosasaurus and the Cretaceous ocean were not object and container. They were co-creators. Each needed the other to be what it was. This is true of many things. Ecosystems work this way, and so do human communities, and perhaps so do the private worlds that each of us carries around inside ourselves. Those particular arrangements of relationships and habits and understandings that make us who we are at any given moment. When those arrangements change, when the people or conditions or circumstances that were part of them shift, the self that was made by that arrangement shifts too. Sometimes the shift is small, sometimes it is the equivalent of a mass extinction. But in both cases, in the ocean and in the life of a person, what survives is what had, all along, the quality of not being too specifically committed to the conditions that have now changed. The question that the Mosasaurus's silence asks, the question that the Cretaceous ocean's recovery answers, is not about whether the loss was worth it or whether the change was good or bad. The question is more fundamental. It is simply, what survives? Not what should survive, not what deserves to survive, but what in fact, given the specific constraints of the changed world, has the qualities necessary to persist, the small, the flexible, the organisms whose metabolic requirements are modest enough to be met by what the depleted world can offer, the ones who can change their diet, the ones who can slow down, the ones who can wait. In the long run, across the long record of the Earth's history, it is always the patient ones who are there to see what comes next. The mammals survived. They had been small and marginal and nocturnal for 100 million years, hiding from dinosaurs in the dark, developing their warm blood and their complex social behaviours and their large metabolically expensive brains in the ecological margins, in the spaces the dinosaurs didn't use. When the dinosaurs were gone, the mammals moved into the spaces left behind, and they did not fill them the way the dinosaurs had filled them. They filled them in the mammalian way, with warm blood and complex behaviour, and high metabolic rates and long parental investment in a small number of offspring. Different entirely from the reptilian way, but effective, and over the following 66 million years, startlingly breathtakingly effective, producing among other things the blue whale, which is larger than any dinosaur that ever lived, and you. And from the mammals, eventually you. This is the genealogy that the KPG extinction event made possible. Not intentionally, not in any purposive sense. The asteroid did not fall in order to make room for mammals. The Mosasaurus did not die in order to create the conditions for the evolution of primates. These are just the events that happened, in sequence, without intent, building toward a complexity that was not planned but simply emerged from the available materials and conditions, the way complexity always emerges from available materials and conditions when you give it enough time and enough selection pressure. The way everything beautiful in the history of life has emerged, not designed, but found. The way water finds the lowest point inevitably given enough time and enough landscape. You are the current expression of the same process that made the Mosasaurus, the same fundamental chemistry, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, arranged differently, organized by the same fundamental physical and chemical laws. The same fundamental problem, how to persist in an environment that is indifferent to whether you persist. The same fundamental solution, burn energy, maintain internal conditions within viable limits, find and consume other organisms, reproduce. The details are different, the scale is different. The time scale on which the solutions were developed is the same. Hundreds of millions of generations of survival and selection and modification, each generation inheriting the solutions of all the previous generations and adding its small contribution to the next. The Mosasaurus is your cousin in this sense. A distant cousin, separated by something like 400 million years of divergent evolution, by the gap between the reptile lineage and the mammal lineage that opened in the Carboniferous and has never fully closed. But cousin nonetheless. The basic architecture, the bilateral body, the internal skeleton, the circulatory system, the sensory organs, the brain, you share with the Mosasaurus, in modified and elaborated forms. You are what happened to the fish that climbed out of the Devonian shallows, modified over hundreds of millions of years by conditions and selections and accidents and extinctions, arriving eventually at the particular form that is lying here, in the dark, listening to a story about a great ocean predator that went still 66 million years ago. The silence the Mosasaurus left behind is in you, in some molecular sense, in the evolutionary memory encoded in the genome you carry. The selective pressures that made your ancestors small and nocturnal and thermally self-sufficient. Those pressures were created partly by the ecological dominance of the very creatures whose absence your ancestors would eventually need in order to flourish. The Mosasaurus's world was the pressure that made your ancestors what they were. In a strange sense, the Mosasaurus helped make you. Not by dying, not specifically, but by existing, by occupying the space that kept your ancestors small and patient and adaptable. Qualities that the 66 million year history after the KPG boundary would turn out to need more than it needed size and thermal dominance. These two strategies, maximum exploitation and minimum requirement, the specialist and the generalist, the animal that is everything to its world and the animal that can fit into any world, exist in a particular kind of tension that runs through the entire history of life. In good times, the specialists win. In the long times, the generalists endure. The Cretaceous was a good time for a very long time. Then it ended, and what was left was the enduring, the small and the flexible and the patient. They had always been there, in the margins, in the burrows, in the leaf litter, waiting without knowing they were waiting, surviving without knowing they were practicing for survival. The Mosasaurus was magnificent in its moment. This is true without qualification, without nostalgia, without the wish that things had been different. Magnificent in its moment. The ammonites were ancient and beautiful and functional in their moment. The Cretaceous ocean, in its fullness, was one of the richest and most complex ecosystems the planet has ever produced. None of this required permanence to be true. Magnificence is not conditional on persistence. Beauty does not require immortality. The Mosasaurus was what it was, entirely and completely, and what it was is real, and will remain real, in the stone and in the story and in the evolutionary history that its existence helped to shape, regardless of how long ago it went still. The silence, in the end, is not an absence, it is a record. The silence of the Cretaceous ocean after the Mosasaurus is a record of everything the Mosasaurus was, encoded in the changed behaviour of the fish, in the altered chemistry of the water, in the different shape of the ammonite shells, in the tentative expansion of the recovering ecosystem, in the slowly rebuilding soundscape of a world that had been organised around one particular enormous, magnificent fact. The fact is gone. The record of it is everywhere, and the record, as we have seen through this long night, is what persists. The record is the form of memory available to an ocean. The record is the form of memory available to stone, and this story tonight is the form of memory available to you. Rest in this. Rest in the understanding that the things we are made of persist even when the particular forms they take do not. The calcium in the Mosasaurus's bones was in the sea, before the Mosasaurus, and is in the sea still, circulating in different forms, carried by different organisms, doing different work in different bodies under a different sky. The energy that the Mosasaurus gathered from its prey and used to swim and hunt and breathe has dispersed back into the system it came from, available again for other organisms to capture and use. The forms change, the substance continues, the night continues, and you are still here, still warm, still breathing, the most recent expression of a persistence that stretches back, unbroken, to the first life in the first ocean, still here, still breathing, still. There is an ocean today. You know this without being told. The ocean today is full of life, a different collection of life from the Cretaceous sea, built on different lineages, organised around different apex predators, making different sounds and producing different chemical environments. But it is still the ocean. The same water, in many cases literally the same molecules of water that the Mosasaurus swam through. Water is recycled on this planet on timescales of millions of years, evaporating from the ocean surface and falling as rain and flowing back to the sea, cycling through the bodies of organisms and back into the environment. The water in the modern ocean contains water that was in the Cretaceous sea, some of it was in the Mosasaurus, some of it was in you yesterday and will be in the ocean in a century. This is not a metaphor, this is chemistry. The water molecule you drank this morning has a history that goes back to the formation of the Earth, that has passed through the bodies of organisms you have no names for, that has been ice and steam and rain and river and ocean in cycles you cannot count. The hydrogen atoms in that water were formed in the first minutes of the universe. The oxygen atoms were forged in the cores of stars that burned out before the sun existed. You're drinking the universe when you drink water. You're drinking the Cretaceous ocean. You're drinking the Mosasaurus. The modern ocean carries the Mosasaurus in another sense too, the genetic legacy. The fish that survived the KPG extinction are the ancestors of the fish in the modern ocean. Their genomes carry the evolutionary responses to mosasaurian predation, the adaptations that were tuned to the Mosasaurus's hunting style, encoded in the DNA of living fish, even though the pressure that created those adaptations no longer exists. Evolution does not delete its old work when the conditions that created it change. It modifies and elaborates and overlays new solutions onto old ones, but the older layers remain, expressed in modified form or suppressed by more recent adaptations, but present in the genome, part of the deep history that every living organism carries in its cells. The fish around a modern great white shark do something that would be recognizable to a Cretaceous fish. They school more tightly in its presence. They choose different depths. They show a specific suite of behavioral responses to the shark's chemical and pressure signature that they do not show in the absence of a large predator. The evolutionary memory of apex predation is so deeply encoded in the fish genome that it generalizes, applying old responses to new threats that share the same functional characteristics as the ancient ones. The fish do not know the difference between a Mosasaurus and a great white shark. They know only the signature of large predator nearby, and they respond accordingly, as their ancestors did, as their ancestors' ancestors did, as far back as the Cretaceous and beyond. The behavior the Mosasaurus shaped is still being performed by fish that have never heard the name Mosasaurus in an ocean the Mosasaurus never knew. The sharks that patrol the modern ocean are not the sharks of the Cretaceous, but they are the descendants of the sharks that survived it. The modern great white, the apex predator of the contemporary ocean in many parts of the world, is in some sense the inheritor of the ecological role that the Mosasaurus occupied. Not the same animal, not even closely related, a cartilaginous fish versus a reptile is about as different as two large marine predators can be, but functionally similar. A large, fast, warm water hunter with excellent sensory systems and no natural predators, sitting at the top of its food web and organizing the behavior of everything below it through the simple fact of its presence. The role endures, the players change, the game continues. The whales arrived, as mentioned, 40 to 50 million years after the Cretaceous ended. Their arrival represented a second great experiment in making a large marine predator from land-dwelling ancestors, parallel to the experiment that made the Mosasaurus from monitor lizards. The whales chose different solutions. Where the Mosasaurus became more reptilian in its body form, elongated and sinuously propelled, the whales became streamlined in a different way, retaining the mammalian body plan but modifying it through a different set of engineering decisions. The horizontal flukes of the whale tail, which move up and down rather than side to side, reflect the mammalian spinal flexibility, which bends most naturally in the dorsoventral plane. The whale is solving the same problem the Mosasaurus solved, how to be large and fast in the water, but solving it from a mammal's toolkit rather than a reptile's. That the two solutions arrived at similar scales of body size and ecological dominance from such different starting points is one of the most striking demonstrations of convergent evolution in the fossil record. The great whales, the blue whale and the fin whale and the humpback, are the largest animals that have ever existed on Earth, larger than any dinosaur, larger than the largest Mosasaurus. They are also among the most sonically complex animals the ocean has ever contained. The songs of humpback whales, which can travel hundreds of kilometers through deep ocean sound channels, are genuinely complex acoustic structures, changing year by year as individuals incorporate new elements and spread them through the population like cultural transmissions. The Mosasaurus made sounds, certainly, the movement sounds and the predatory sounds of any large marine animal. But the whale songs represent something new in the ocean's acoustic history, a layer of intentional, elaborated communication that the Cretaceous did not have. The ocean, 66 million years on, has found a way to be louder and stranger and more complex than the Cretaceous ever managed to make it. The modern ocean, in other words, has sounds that the Cretaceous never heard. It has whale song, which is haunting and complex and carries over distances that would astonish the ancient sea. It has the clicks of echolocating dolphins, a biological sonar system so precise that dolphins can detect the difference between objects the size of a coin at distances of many meters through the water, a sensory technology that the Cretaceous produced nothing equivalent to. It has the sounds of industrialized human civilization, the drone of ship engines and the percussion of sonar and the industrial noise that has changed the acoustic environment of the modern ocean in ways that are still being studied. But beneath all of these modern sounds, the ocean still has its ancient sounds, the click and rustle of invertebrates feeding, the low-frequency movements of fish schools, the sound of the surface in various wind conditions. The geological sounds, the distant rumble of submarine earthquakes, the hiss of hydrothermal vents. These sounds have been in the ocean since before the first mosasaur ancestor waded into the shallows. They will outlast us too. You came from this ocean. Not directly, not recently, not in any way that your everyday consciousness tracks or acknowledges. But the evolutionary lineage that produced you spent hundreds of millions of years in the water before it produced the first terrestrial vertebrates, and those terrestrial vertebrates spent millions more years in intimate relationship with water, for reproduction, for food, for the cooling and the chemistry that only water can reliably provide. The water is in your body. Roughly 60% of you, by weight, is water. Water that was in the ocean. Water that is always cycling back to the ocean. Water that will be in the ocean long after you have returned everything you borrowed from the planet to the planet's general account. The Cretaceous ocean is not gone. It is continuous with the modern ocean, a single unbroken body of water that has been here for 4 billion years, changing its configuration as the continents moved, changing its chemistry as the biology that lived in it evolved and diversified and went extinct and was replaced, but never emptied, never absent, never anything other than exactly what it is. The place where the planet keeps most of its water and most of its life and most of its memory of everything that has ever swum through it. And perhaps this, finally, is what the stillness of the Mosasaurus has to tell you, across 66 million years of time and change, that the ocean remembers, that it is larger than any individual life within it, and older than any catastrophe that has reshaped it, and more patient than anything that has ever lived in it. That the water that was in the Mosasaurus is in the ocean still, and in you now, and will be in the ocean long after everything currently alive has completed its chapter and been returned to the common account. That the forms pass, and the substances continue, and the story, the long, patient, inexhaustible story of life making itself in water, goes on. You're in that story tonight, here in this dark, in the warmth of wherever you are resting, with your breathing slowed and your body heavy with the pleasant weight of almost sleep. The ocean is still out there, in the dark, whichever direction it lies from you. The waves are moving as they have always moved, the water turning over its slow chemical cycles as it has turned them for 4 billion years. The Mosasaurus is in the stone somewhere under that water, in the chalky layers of the seafloor, patient as only stone can be patient. The ammonites are in the stone with it, their spirals unchanged, their buoyancy chambers still sealed against the water that has surrounded them for 66 million years. This is the world you live in, not a world that ended, but a world that continued, changed and changed again, arriving at this particular night and this particular darkness, and this particular version of you. Warm-blooded, conscious, lying down, listening to the story of what the ocean was before you were here to see it. The ocean will be here long after, and in the long middle of it all, in the geological instant of a human life, you have been here, in the water, in some sense, always. You have been here, and you have listened, and the story has settled into you the way sediment settles through water, slowly, continuously, without effort, laying down its fine layers until what was floating in suspension has become, by the patient accumulation of small things, something solid. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The water is still around you. The dark water of the deep ancient sea, which is also the dark of your room, which is also the dark behind your closed eyes. These darknesses are connected, all of them, the way all water is connected, the way all darkness shares the same fundamental quality of being the absence of light and the presence of something else, something that does not require light to exist, and that light, when it arrives, does not destroy but only briefly covers. You are in the water. The Cretaceous water that was also the Devonian water, that was also the Cambrian water, that was also the water of the first ocean, 4 billion years ago, before the first living thing had yet dissolved in it. The water has been here longer than anything alive has been here. The water will be here after everything alive has returned to it. The water does not worry about this. The water is just water. The Mosasaurus is gone. It went still on a night very much like this one, in the sense that all nights are very much like each other in their darkness and their quiet and their tendency to hold things that the day is too busy to hold. It went still, and the ocean noticed, and the ocean continued, and the darkness continued, and the stars that were above the Cretaceous sea were some of the same stars that are above you now, unchanged in their positions relative to each other, changed only in their distance from where you are, because the planet that carries you has moved through space since then, in its long, spiraling orbit around a star that is itself moving through the arm of a galaxy, that is itself moving through space in directions that have no names in any language. You are moving even now in your stillness. The planet is moving, the galaxy is moving, everything is moving, always, at scales too large to feel but real nonetheless. And here, in the stillness of this night, in the warmth of your particular arrangement of blankets and pillows, and the specific quality of darkness that your room produces, you are the still point. You are the Mosasaurus floating at the surface. You are the ammonite adjusting its buoyancy. You are the plesiosaur with its neck trailing in the current. You are every animal that has ever, in the long history of animal life on this planet, arrived at the point of rest and accepted it. The water is warm. You did not choose the warmth, but it is there. The same warmth that the Cretaceous sea held in its upper layers, the warmth of solar energy stored and distributed, the warmth of a planet that is, despite everything, a habitable and even comfortable place to be. Let the warmth be what it is. Let it work on the muscles that are still holding more tension than they need to hold. Let it move into the places where the day left its traces. Let it do what warmth does in the dark, which is the work of slow release. The sound in the water is very quiet now. The fish have settled. The ammonites have found their depth. The plesiosaur is barely moving, its heart doing its slow, cold work, its body at minimum. The Mosasaurus is on the floor of the sea, returning to the chemistry of the water. Everything is at rest. The Cretaceous night is very quiet, and your night is very quiet, and they are the same night in the way that all quiet nights are the same night, connected by the shared quality of stillness that the dark always produces in things that are alive and paying attention. Let your attention soften now. It has been precise and focused for many hours of this day, tracking things, solving things, responding to things. Let it go soft now. Let it become the kind of attention that notices the warmth and the quiet and the slight sound of your own breathing, and is satisfied with these things. Not everything needs to be tracked. Not everything needs a response. The dark is not a problem. The quiet is not a problem. The approaching sleep is not a problem. They are simply the next part of the night, waiting, patient as the Cretaceous sea, for you to arrive in them. You are arriving now. The breathing is slower than it was at the beginning of this story. The thoughts that were moving through the mind at the beginning of this story have slowed, have become less sequential, less insistent. They are the fish loosening their school. They are the ammonite ascending toward the surface, not urgently, not with any particular destination in mind, just moving in the direction of less pressure. Let them move, let them drift. They will be there when you need them. They always are. Thoughts are patient that way. The dark is very dark. The quiet is very quiet. The water is very warm. The Mosasaurus is at rest on the floor of an ocean that no longer exists and exists in everything. The ammonites are in the stone, their spirals perfect and preserved and waiting to be found by a small primate with a hammer and a sense of wonder. The plesiosaur is in the stone. The sea turtle is in the stone. The fish, the plankton, the chalk beds, the iridium layer, the KPG boundary itself, all in the stone, all preserved, all real, all part of the story that the planet has been telling itself for 4 billion years. You're in the story. You're the part of the story that is happening right now, tonight, in this particular arrangement of dark and warmth and quiet. And the story, for this part of its telling, asks nothing more of you than to sleep, to rest, to let the day's chemical records be consolidated into memory while the body does its nighttime work of repair and regulation, to let the breathing continue without assistance, to let the darkness be the darkness and the warmth be the warmth and the quiet be the quiet. Sleep now. The Cretaceous sea will hold you. The ancient water will hold you. The long night of geological time, which has been patient through extinctions and recoveries, and the rising and falling of oceans and the movement of continents, will hold you through this much smaller night, this night that asks of you only what the Mosasaurus finally gave it: stillness. Complete, unrestricted, peaceful stillness. Sleep. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I am always curious about that, and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.